Hello and welcome back. Before we get into anything at all, settle in properly. Get the pillow the way you like it, flip to the cool side if that's your thing, and let the blanket land wherever's comfortable. If there's a drink on the nightstand, have a sip now, because once we're going, I'd rather you didn't have to move. There's no rush tonight, there's nowhere for either of us to be. We're just going to settle in and talk for a good long while about a cartoon. And I mean that fondly, by the way, a cartoon. 4 kids in a small mountain town in Colorado, drawn to look like they were cut out of construction paper by someone who had had a fairly relaxed afternoon. A town where the laws of physics are more of a loose suggestion, where a talking piece of Christmas poo is a recurring character, and where a group of 4th graders have somehow remained 4th graders for the better part of 30 years. We're talking about South Park. Now, anyone who spent real time with this show already knows it isn't as simple as it looks, and if you're coming to it cold tonight, never having watched a minute, that might honestly be the richer way in, because what's underneath South Park is one of the stranger and bleaker things I've come across in television. A show that hides behind fart jokes and celebrity impressions and enormous amounts of swearing, and then, when you're not really paying attention, tucks something devastating into the corner of the frame and leaves it there. Waiting, sometimes for a whole season, sometimes, honestly, for decades. That's what I want to spend the night on. Not really the news of the week stuff, not the episode where they made fun of whoever it was that particular Wednesday. I want to talk about the threads, the bits of lore that run underneath the whole thing. The mysteries the show set up early and didn't bother explaining until much, much later, and the ones it never explained at all. The stuff that seems like a throwaway gag the first time you see it, and then, on a rewatch, quietly turns your stomach a little. Because here's the thing about South Park, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to properly notice this. The show gets darker the more you revisit it. Not because it changes. The episodes are exactly the same as they always were. It's you that changes. You come back with a bit more context, a bit more of the whole picture, and suddenly a joke you laughed at when you were younger isn't quite a joke anymore. It was always this thing. You just didn't have everything you needed to see it the first time. And the show knew. It left the thing sitting right there in the frame the whole time and let you get there in your own time. Which is a genuinely unusual thing for a series built on the reputation of being lowbrow to be doing. I should say, before we go any further, the surface here isn't a con. This is important, and I want to be clear about it, because I'm going to spend a lot of tonight pulling back layers and finding sad things underneath, and I don't want to give you the wrong impression. The jokes are real jokes. The show is funny. The warmth of the town, in its odd way, is genuine. It's not baiting you into something grim and then laughing at you for enjoying the surface. It's more that the whole thing runs on 2 levels at once, and both of them are fully working. You can watch it as a very silly cartoon about kids saying rude things, and that's a completely valid way to watch it. Loads of people did exactly that for years and had a great time. And you can watch it as something else, something with a surprising amount of quiet despair folded into it, and that's valid too. The trick, if there is one, is that it never made you choose. The show turned up in 1997 on a channel almost nobody was watching at the time, and more or less immediately became a phenomenon. And it never stopped. That's the part that still gets me a bit, actually. It's still going. As I'm recording this, it's been renewed to run for years, yet on a deal worth an amount of money that would make your eyes water. The kind of number that gets $1 billion in it. A cartoon that started as a couple of guys animating paper cutouts has become a permanent fixture, still turning up, still describing whatever the world is doing that week. There's something a little uncanny about that longevity when you sit with it, and we'll get to why, but hold on to the fact for now. Same 4 kids, same bus stop, same snow. So here's roughly where we're headed, and I say roughly because I don't want you tracking a schedule. We're going to spend some time with Kenny, the kid in the orange parka who is on the surface the simplest character in the whole show, and is, underneath, carrying something awful. We'll spend time with Cartman, who you probably already know is a problem, but maybe not the full shape of the problem. We'll sit with Butters for a while, who I have a lot of feelings about. We'll talk about the town itself, the actual rules of the place, which is where the real darkness lives if you ask me. We'll get into the episode where the show turned the camera on itself and admitted something it probably shouldn't have. We'll follow one particular dad down a road that ends somewhere much worse than you'd expect. We'll talk about a death that's darker off the screen than on it. There's a talking towel with a drug problem. And near the end, we'll talk about how the whole thing has slowly darkened right alongside the world it's been watching. The bits tonight stand on their own. That's on purpose. If you drift off somewhere in the Cartman section and surface again during the towel, you won't have missed a payoff, because there aren't any payoffs, not in the cliffhanger sense. Nothing's being held back for some big reveal at the end. Each part just sits there beside the others, whole by itself. So if you feel yourself going, let yourself go. That's the point of this. I'd rather you fell asleep happy than fought to stay up for an ending, because the ending is just me saying goodnight quietly in a couple of hours' time. If you're new around here and you find you like this sort of thing, there's a subscribe button somewhere near this video, and it does help me keep making these. That's the only time I'll mention it. I'm not going to badger you about it at the end while you're trying to sleep. That would be rude. Right. Let me get comfortable myself, because this is a long one. Let's start with the kid in the orange parka, because out of everyone in that town, he's the one who knows what's going on. And he can tell a soul. Kenny McCormick is, on the face of it, the least complicated of the four boys. He's the poor one. He lives in a rundown house on the wrong side of a town that doesn't have a particularly nice side to begin with. His parents drink too much and shout too much, and on the evidence, don't spend a great deal of time thinking about their son. He wears an orange parka, pulled so tight around his face that you can barely see him. And when he talks, it comes out as a muffled mumble that you're mostly not meant to understand, though the other kids always seem to. That's Kenny. Poor kid, orange coat, can't hear a word he says. And for the first several years of the show, his defining feature, the thing that made him Kenny, rather than just a fourth boy standing at the bus stop, was that he died. Constantly, almost every episode. It became one of the most famous running gags on television, to the point where people who've never watched a full episode of South Park can still tell you the two lines that went with it. Something horrible would happen to Kenny, something creative and abrupt, and usually quite silly. He'd be hit by a car, he'd be struck by lightning, he'd be crushed by something falling out of the sky, or eaten by something, or he'd simply explode for no adequately explained reason. And then one of the other boys would shout, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," and another would shout, "You bastards," and that was the ritual. That was the whole bit. And the thing that made it a proper gag rather than just a violent moment was what came after, which was nothing. Next episode, Kenny would be back, alive, fine, standing at the bus stop in his orange coat as if the previous week's grisly death had never happened. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody in the town seemed troubled by the fact that this specific child kept dying and then turning up again. It was just part of the furniture of the show, as fixed and unremarkable as Cartman being awful or the snow on the ground. Kenny dies. That's his thing. And for a long time, that genuinely was the whole of it. The show eventually explained the deaths. It eventually gestured at an explanation. It didn't seem to think an explanation was owed, and honestly, for years, it wasn't. It was funny. It was a bit dark in the way that a cartoon violently killing a child every week is inherently a bit dark, but it lived comfortably in the register of a gag. You laughed or you winced, and you moved on, and so did the show. That held for years. And then, eventually, it stopped holding. Somewhere around the show's 14th season, in a set of episodes built around the boys forming a little superhero team, the show did something it had never done before with Kenny. It took him seriously, not in a way that killed the comedy, because that's never been how this show operates, but in a way that reached underneath the gag and found something there that, had it turned out, been there the whole time. In these episodes, each of the boys has a superhero identity. Most of them are obviously just kids in costumes playing pretend, which is the joke. But Kenny's alter ego, a hooded figure called Mysterion, is different. And the difference is the whole point, because unlike the others, Kenny isn't pretending. Mysterion's power, his actual power, is that he cannot die. And within the story, this is not played as a child's fantasy. It's played as true. There's a scene, and I remember the specific weight of it the first time I saw it, where Kenny, as Mysterion, stands in front of his friends and tells them plainly that he can't die. He tells them he's been killed over and over, more times than he can count, and that he always comes back, and that not one single person ever remembers it happening. His friends reasonably don't believe him. They think he's exaggerating or making it up or just committing very hard to the superhero thing. So Kenny, standing right there in front of them, pulls out a gun and shoots himself in the head. And everyone is horrified. Of course they are. They're screaming, they're crying, they cannot process what they've just watched their friend do. And then the next morning, Kenny wakes up in his own bed, completely fine, and goes to school, and sees the very same friends who watched him die the night before. And not one of them remembers it. Not one. To them, it's just an ordinary morning. Kenny's just Kenny. Now sit with that for a second, because that is a bleak thing to have built underneath what was, for years, a lighthearted gag. The horror of Kenny's situation, once the show finally lets you see it, isn't the dying. Dying for Kenny is almost mundane at this point. It's routine. The horror is that nobody knows. He dies alone in whatever terrible way that particular death takes, and he feels it. And then he comes back, and there's no one to talk to about it, because the very act of it happening erases itself from everyone else's memory the moment it's done. He is completely, structurally, cosmically alone in the one experience that defines his entire existence. And there's nothing he can do about it. He can't even make his best friends believe him for longer than a single evening. And then the show goes further because it decides you should know where this comes from. And the answer is so perfectly South Park that I laughed and felt slightly sick at the same time. Kenny confronts his parents about it, and they admit that years ago, before he was born, they attended a meeting of something called the Cult of Cthulhu, an actual cult dedicated to the ancient cosmic horror entity from H.P. Lovecraft's stories. His parents joined this cult, and the reason they joined, the reason they signed their unborn child up for an eternity of dying and being reborn and never being remembered, was that the cult was offering free boobs. Free boobs, that's it. That's the whole reason Kenny's parents attended the cult's meetings. It offered free beer. Kenny's parents condemned their son to a private, unending, Lovecraftian nightmare because someone was handing out free boobs. And when you learn that, you understand something about the show's whole worldview, which is that the largest and most cosmic horrors in it tend to trace back to the smallest and most pathetic human failings. Nobody in South Park suffers for a grand reason. They suffer because their parents wanted a free pint. There's a moment at the end of that run of episodes that is, I think, one of the most haunting things the show has ever made, and I'd put it up against anything from a show that takes itself far more seriously. Kenny has died again. He's come back again. Nobody remembers again. And he is so tired. He tells his friends, in the exhausted way of someone at the absolute end of their rope, that he's going to bed, and then he shoots himself one more time. And his friends are horrified all over again, freshly horrified, as if for the first time, because for them it is the first time. They'll have forgotten by morning. They always do. And the scene cuts to Kenny's house, where his mother jolts awake in the night, clutching her stomach, crying out in pain. And she says the words, "It's happening again." And the next thing you see is her placing a newborn baby wrapped in a tiny orange parka into a crib. She turns to her husband and with real regret in her voice, she says, "We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting." That line changes the whole show. I don't know about you, but the first time I properly watched those episodes, I wasn't ready for the show to go there. I'd known South Park since I was far too young to be watching it, the way a lot of people my age did, sneaking it when the adults weren't paying attention. And Kenny's deaths had always been, in my head, filed firmly under joke. A funny, morbid little bit that the show did, finding out there was this whole architecture of sadness underneath it, that Kenny wasn't a punchline but a boy trapped in something no one could even perceive, was one of those moments where a show reaches back through its own history and rewrites everything you thought you'd already understood. Every single one of those early deaths, the ones I'd laughed at, stopped being funny in quite the same way. They became something closer to a tragedy that nobody in the room, including me, had been paying attention to. There's a small, unresolved wrinkle worth mentioning too, in that specific way South Park has of leaving a thread hanging just to see if you'll pull it. Because while nobody in the show consistently remembers Kenny's deaths, there is a persistent fan theory that one character has occasionally shown flickers of awareness. Cartman. The idea goes that because Cartman once received one of Kenny's eyes in a transplant, he picked up a partial, unreliable connection to Kenny's perspective. Not full memory, not real understanding, just the odd flash of something, the sense that he knows something about Kenny that he shouldn't. Is this confirmed? No. Has it been denied? Also no. And that, honestly, is what keeps it interesting. The show leaves the door open a crack and doesn't tell you what's behind it. And so people keep peering through, which is exactly the behavior the show seems to want to encourage. It plants these things and then just walks away whistling. What really gets me, though, when I think about all of this is what the show did with Kenny's deaths afterwards, once it had revealed what they actually were. Because you might expect them to just carry on as before, but they don't. In the early years, Kenny died in nearly every episode relentlessly. As the show went on, the deaths got rarer, and when he did die in the later seasons, it landed differently, heavier. It meant something in a way it hadn't when it was happening weekly. Once the show had shown you the loneliness underneath the gag, it couldn't quite go back to playing the gag purely for laughs. The joke had become something else, and the show, to its considerable credit, honored that rather than pretending it hadn't happened. It let the thing it had built change how the old bit felt. That's a restraint you don't often see in comedy. In a strange way, I think Kenny might quietly be the most important character in the whole show. Not because he drives the most plots, because he doesn't. Not because he gets the most screen time, because for years you could barely hear him. But because he's the one character who has seen behind the curtain. He knows what the rest of them don't. He's died and come back enough times to understand at some level that the rules of the place he lives in are broken in a fundamental and horrible way. And he can't tell anyone. He carries the one true piece of knowledge in the entire town, and the town is built so that he can never share it. That's the real tragedy of Kenny McCormick, if you ask me. Not the dying he could probably live with, so to speak. It's the loneliness. It's being the only one who remembers. Although actually, let me take that back slightly because there might be something even simpler and sadder at the bottom of it. His parents went to a cult meeting for free beer. And their little boy has been paying for that one small stupid decision ever since, over and over, forever, without even the dignity of being remembered for it. If that isn't the most South Park way imaginable to explain cosmic horror, I genuinely don't know what is. The universe is vast and terrible and indifferent, and it got its hooks into one specific child because two adults wanted a drink they didn't have to pay for. Anyway, that's Kenny. That's the boy in the orange coat and the enormous, quiet weight he's been carrying under it the whole time. Let's talk about someone who carries no weight at all, and probably should. Because if Kenny is the one who suffers and can't tell anyone, Cartman is the one who makes everyone else suffer and never has to answer for a single second of it. Eric Cartman is one of the most beloved characters in the history of television, and I want to start there with that fact because it's a slightly uncomfortable place to start, and I think the discomfort is the whole point. He's selfish, he's manipulative, he's a liar and a schemer and a bigot in more or less every direction a person can be bigoted. He is, by any reasonable measure, a bad person, and not in a charming rogue sort of way where it all turns out fine underneath. There's no gold beneath the surface with Cartman. When you dig, you find more of the same and something worse. And yet people adore him. He's the character people quote. The one on the merchandise, the one who gets the biggest laughs. The show built one of its most popular figures out of someone you'd cross the street to avoid, and it did it on purpose, and I think it did it partly to see whether you'd notice. Because here's how the show handles Cartman most of the time. It lets him be funny, it really does. He's quick, he's committed, he'll take a plan to lengths that no rational person would, and there's a real comic pleasure in watching someone with no limits at all just go for it. And so you laugh and you kind of root for him, and the show lets you do that for a good long stretch. And then every so often it stops and it shows you very plainly exactly what this person is. And it doesn't soften it, it doesn't give you an out, it just holds it up and lets you look. The clearest example of this, and the one most people point to, comes fairly early in the 5th season. It's an episode widely regarded as the show's finest and also its darkest. And it's the episode that essentially defined Cartman as a character forever after. And the setup, I promise, could not sound more trivial. It starts with Cartman being humiliated over pubic hair. That's the whole inciting incident. An older kid named Scott Tenorman, who is a few years above the boys and therefore infinitely more sophisticated in their eyes, sells Cartman some pubic hair for $10, having convinced him that buying puberty is a thing you can do. When the other boys point out that this is not how puberty works and that Cartman has essentially been robbed, Cartman becomes fixated on getting his money back. And Scott, who is cleverer than Cartman, humiliates him again and again in the process. He runs him in circles, he makes him dance like a pig, he burns the money in front of him. And each time, Cartman comes away angrier and more debased, until eventually something in him tips over from wanting his money back into wanting something much larger and much worse. Now, on a first watch, you think you know where this is going. You think it's going to be one of those escalating prank wars where the two of them keep one-upping each other and it all ends in some suitably ridiculous fashion. And for most of the episode, that's what it looks like. Cartman tries various schemes, they mostly fail. Scott stays a step ahead. There's a whole business with a pony that I won't fully get into, but it involves Cartman trying to train the animal to bite a very specific part of Scott's anatomy. And it does not go to plan. It's silly, it's the show doing its usual thing. And then, at the very end, the whole thing snaps into a completely different shape. And you realize the silliness was covered the entire time. Because it turns out Cartman has been running a much longer and much colder game than anyone, Scott included, understood. He arranges a chili cook-off and invites Scott to it. And Scott, thinking he's the clever one, has his own plan to humiliate Cartman there. But Cartman has anticipated all of it. He's anticipated that his own friends would betray him and warn Scott. He's anticipated exactly how Scott would try to sabotage him. And he's used all of that. He's manipulated events so that Scott's parents end up trespassing on a ranch owned by a man with a habit of shooting trespassers, and the man shoots them both dead. And Cartman, arriving at the scene, takes the bodies, and he butchers them, and he cooks them into the chili. And he feeds Scott's own murdered parents to Scott at the cook-off in front of everyone, and then waits for the moment Scott realizes what he's eaten before telling him, with delight, exactly what he's done. And then, and this is the part that seals it, Cartman doesn't feel bad. There's no flicker of it. He climbs up onto the table and he sings. He gloats. He savors it. He calls it the best thing that's ever happened to him. Scott sobs, broken, in front of the whole town, and Cartman licks the tears off Scott's face and describes them as delicious. That's the note the show chooses to end on, not remorse, not consequence. Just Cartman, at the peak of his happiness, having orchestrated the murder of 2 adults and the psychological destruction of a child and loving every second of it. I remember watching that for the first time and feeling the floor go out a bit. Because up until then, Cartman had been a nasty piece of work, sure, but a cartoon nasty piece of work. Loud, greedy, prejudiced, the kind of villain you laugh at. And this episode, quietly, without much fanfare, told you that the ceiling on what this character will do is, there is no ceiling. He will have your parents killed and cooked and fed to you, and he will sing about it. And the show was only 5 seasons in when it told you that. Everything Cartman did afterwards, every scheme, every cruelty, you now had to watch knowing that this was the same person who did that, and that he'd do it again if the mood took him. And the town does nothing. That's the part that recontextualizes everything. And it's the part I want to sit with for a moment, because there's no arrest. There's no reckoning. 2 people are murdered, and the responsible child is not so much as told off. Life in South Park simply resets, and the next week, Cartman is back at the bus stop as if nothing happened, because in the world of the show, functionally, nothing did. The town absorbed it. The town always absorbs it. And it gets darker, because of course it does, and this is the thing about revisiting South Park that I keep coming back to. The episode was already about as bleak as a cartoon can be. And then, years later, in a completely different episode, the show casually dropped one more piece of information that reached all the way back and made the original somehow worse. Because it's revealed much later that Scott Tenorman's father, the man Cartman had killed and cooked, was not just some stranger. He was, through an affair years earlier, also Cartman's father. Which means Scott and Cartman are half-brothers. Which means that Cartman, in his great triumph in the cruelest and most calculated thing he ever did, unknowingly had his own father killed and butchered, and then fed him to his own brother and gloated about it. He didn't know. That's the thing. The victory he was so proud of, the one he sang about on the table, contained a private catastrophe he had no idea he'd caused. And when he eventually learns the truth, he doesn't grieve the father he had killed. That's not what upsets him. What upsets him is a detail about his heritage that wounds his pride. The dead father barely registers. That's who this is. Is that on the first watch? No. On the first watch, it's a shocking, brilliant, horrible piece of dark comedy about a kid taking revenge too far. It's only on the revisit, only once you've got the later piece, that it curdles into something closer to Greek tragedy. The kind of thing where a man destroys himself through the very act he thinks is his masterstroke, and doesn't even know he's done it. The show set up a punchline and then, seasons later, revealed it had been a tragedy the whole time. That's the pattern. That is the pattern over and over, and once you start seeing it, you can't stop. And I think the reason the show keeps a character like Cartman around, keeps him central, keeps letting you enjoy him, is that he's a sort of test. Sound familiar? It should, because we do it in real life all the time. We find the charming monster funny. We give the entertaining, awful person a pass because they make us laugh. Because it's easier than sitting with the fact that they're awful. Cartman is the show handing you that dynamic on a plate and quietly watching what you do with it. You keep rooting for the person who does the worst things imaginable. And the show never once tells you off for it, which is somehow more damning than if it did. There's a version of this show that punishes Cartman, that gives him his comeuppance, that lets you feel good at the end. South Park almost never does that, and I've come to think the refusal is deliberate, because comeuppance would let you off the hook. It would let you enjoy the villainy and then feel cleansed when he loses. By denying you that, by letting him win and win and win and never pay, the show keeps you implicated. You wanted him to get away with it, at least a little, at least enough to see the next scheme. And he does, and that's on you as much as him. What I find genuinely bleak about it, underneath the comedy, is how ordinary the town's tolerance is. Nobody in South Park treats Cartman as a monster because in a place where nothing has consequences and nobody remembers anything, a monster is just another neighbor. He's absorbed into the fabric of the town the same way Kenny's deaths are, the same way everything is. The horror doesn't stand out because there's nothing for it to stand out against. Everyone's just getting on with their week, and that the fact that the town simply has no mechanism for consequence, no memory, no accumulation of anything, is not really a Cartman problem or a Kenny problem. It's a South Park problem. It's built into the walls of the place. And it's honestly the thing I find darkest of all, darker than any one character, so I think we should go there next. Before we do, though, let's leave Cartman where the show always leaves him. On top, unpunished, delighted with himself, having done something unforgivable, standing at the bus stop the next morning as if the world were fresh and clean. Nobody's going to stop him. Almost nobody ever has. That's not an accident, and it's not the show running out of ideas. It's the show telling you something true about the kind of place this is, and maybe about the kind of place a lot of places are. Let's stay with the kids, though, and move to the softest one of the lot. Because Cartman is where the show hides its cruelty in plain sight. Butters is where it hides its heartbreak. There's a particular image of Butterscotch that I think most people carry around in their heads. He's standing somewhere, hands clasped together, rocking slightly on his feet, saying something impossibly gentle and naive in that soft little voice, probably about to be taken advantage of by someone and not remotely seeing it coming. That's the Butters most people know. The sweet one, the innocent, the kid who believes the best about everyone right up until the moment they've clearly wronged him, at which point he tends to blame himself. He started as almost nothing, a background kid without even a proper name in the very early days, and the show slowly promoted him more or less by accident until he became one of its most important characters. When Kenny was killed off for a while, Butters stepped up to fill the fourth spot, and something about him just clicked. He became the show's great innocent, its designated lamb, the one you send into the dangerous situation because he's too trusting to refuse. And on the surface, the comedy of Butters is the comedy of naivety. He's the punchline because he doesn't understand the world well enough to protect himself in it. He gets grounded constantly for things that aren't his fault. He gets roped into other people's schemes and left holding the blame. He's the kid whose optimism is so total that it's funny because the universe of the show is so cynical that his hope reads as a kind of gag in itself. Poor sweet Butters, you think, and you laugh and you move on. But here's the thing, and this is one of those things that once you've properly noticed it, you can't stop noticing, and it changes how every Butters scene lands from then on. Butters is not a happy child. Butters is an abused and neglected child, and the show tells you this, repeatedly, clearly, and then mostly declines to make a big deal of it, which somehow makes it land harder. Let's start with his parents because that's where it starts. Butters' parents ground him for essentially everything, including things that are transparently not his doing. And grounding in the Stotch household is not the mild thing it is in most homes. It's a constant, looming, disproportionate threat, delivered coldly, and Butters lives in fear of it. His father in particular has a way of saying his name, that flat Butters that carries real menace. There's an early episode where the boys need a place to watch television, and every option falls through until they land on Butters, and it comes out almost as an aside that Butters can't have people over because his parents are gone and he doesn't have anyone watching him. A small child, home alone, not for the first time, treating it as normal. The show plays it as a plot mechanic, a reason they can use his house and move straight on. But it's there, it's on the record. This kid is being left alone and nobody's minding him. Then there's the origin of his villain persona, which is one of the saddest little things in the show if you'll look at it directly. In the 6th season, the other boys, still moping over Kenny's death, decide Butters isn't good enough to be Kenny's replacement and they fire him. They literally sit him down and tell him he's no longer fit to be their friend. And Butters goes home and stands at his bedroom window and thinks back over everything he did for them, all the humiliations he endured to be included, and he calls himself an outcast. And out of that rejection, that specific loneliness, he builds a supervillain. He makes a costume out of tin foil and a cape, and he becomes Professor Chaos, bringer of doom. And he goes out into the town to wreak havoc, which mostly amounts to swapping 2 soup orders at a restaurant and watching, thrilled, as the wrong people get the wrong soup. It's played for laughs, and it is funny, this tiny foil-wrapped child trying so hard to be evil and being so bad at it. But the engine underneath it is a lonely, rejected kid inventing a whole identity just to feel like he has some power over a world that keeps discarding him. Even his big villainous turn ends with his mum calling up the stairs to tell him to go to bed. He's a 9-year-old. His rebellion has a bedtime. And then there's the grandmother, and this is where the show stops even pretending it's just a gag. And I have to say, when I first properly clocked this arc, it knocked the wind out of me. In one episode, Butters turns up with a black eye and no lunch, and Stan unusually actually notices and pushes on it. And what unfolds is that Butters' grandmother, who is visiting, is abusing him. Physically, when the adults leave the room, she slaps him, she calls him vile names, she tells him he's her property. She sticks a fork into his leg under the dinner table while the family carries on around them, oblivious. She's careful. She only does it when no one's looking, and she snaps back to a sweet, doting grandmother the instant anyone might see. And Butters, being Butters, mostly just takes it, because taking it is what he does, because he's a child and she's an adult, and he's learned, the way abused children learn, that the safest thing is to absorb it and not make a fuss. Now, the episode wraps this in a whole satirical thing about anti-bullying campaigns, and the resolution is characteristically odd. But strip that away and look at what's being depicted, and it's a harrowing portrait of an abused kid who can't get any of the adults around him to see what's happening, partly because the abuser is skilled at hiding it, and partly because the adults simply aren't paying attention. Which is, when you think about it, the exact same structural horror as Kenny. Something terrible is happening to a child, and the world is arranged so that no one notices. And here's the reframe. The thing that reorganizes the whole character once it clicks. Butters' sweetness, his relentless optimism, his desperate need to please, his habit of blaming himself when he's wronged. On the first watch, that's the joke. He's just naive. He's just soft. But once you've seen the home he comes from, once you've seen the grandmother and the constant grounding and the empty house, that sweetness stops looking like naivety and starts looking like something else entirely. It looks like a survival strategy. It looks like exactly the coping style a neglected, frightened child develops, where you make yourself as agreeable and unthreatening and useful as possible, because being agreeable is the safest way to move through a world run by adults who might hurt you. Butters isn't sweet because he doesn't understand the world. Butters is sweet because he understands it far too well, and this is the only defense he's got. That reframing is quietly devastating, and it's entirely there in the text. The show never says it out loud. It never has a character turn to camera and explain that Butters' cheerfulness is a trauma response. It just shows you the home and shows you the boy and trusts you to put the two next to each other and feel the weight of it, which is the same patience the show showed with Kenny, and it's the same patience it shows again and again. It plants the sad thing and walks away and lets you find it in your own time. And what makes it land even harder for me is how the town treats Butters as against how it treats Cartman. Because we just talked about Cartman, the child who does monstrous things and is never once held to account, absorbed into the town without friction. And here, in the very same town, is Butters, the child who does nothing wrong, who only ever tries to help and please, and who is neglected, abused, bullied, exploited, grounded, and overlooked. The town is exactly as indifferent to Butters' suffering as it is to Cartman's crimes. It doesn't protect the innocent, and it doesn't punish the guilty, because it doesn't really register either. It just carries on. And there's something in that pairing The monster nobody stops and the innocent nobody saves, that tells you more about the moral universe of this show than any single episode ever could. I have a lot of affection for Butters, more than for almost anyone else in the show, and I think it's precisely because of this gap between what he looks like and what he's carrying. He's the one character who could so easily have curdled into a cartman, who had every reason given to him by his upbringing to become cruel and closed off and cynical, and who somehow just didn't. He kept being kind, not because he was too simple to know better, but because kindness was the thing he chose, over and over, in a home and a town that gave him no reason to. There's a version of that which is heartbreaking and a version which is heroic, and Butters is both at once, and the show never asks you to pick. If you want the single image that holds all of it, it's Butters at that dinner table, his grandmother's fork in his leg, his father asking what's wrong, and Butters in pain not telling. Just saying he's a bit gassy. Covering for the person hurting him, keeping the peace, protecting everyone but himself because that's what he's learned to do. The show gives you that and then moves on to the next joke and leaves you sitting there with it, if you happen to be paying attention. Most people weren't the first time. That's all right. That's what the revisits are for. Right, let's pull back from the kids for a bit, because I've been dancing around something through all three of these, and I think it's time to name it directly. The reason nobody saves Butters, and nobody stops Cartman, and nobody remembers Kenny isn't really about those three characters at all. It's about the place they live. So let's talk about the town itself, and the very strange, very bleak rules it runs on. Here's a fact about South Park that's so obvious you've probably stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing the wallpaper in a room you've lived in for years. The boys never grow up. They've been in the 4th grade since 2000. Think about that for a second properly. A child who started watching the show on the day it premiered would be pushing 40 now, with a mortgage and possibly children of their own who are older than Stan. And Stan is now 10, still at the bus stop. Still in the 4th grade, where he has now sat for longer than most actual human careers last. And it's not just the aging, it's everything. The town resets, every week, more or less. Whatever catastrophe befell South Park is simply gone by the next episode. The town gets destroyed, and it's fine. Characters die, and they come back, and nobody comments. The most extreme version of this is Kenny, obviously, who we've already spent time with, dying weekly and returning weekly with the universe scrubbed clean of it. But it's the whole town, really. The Pope turns out to be a rabbit. Climate change shows up as a literal monster that eats people. An enormous amount of genuinely apocalyptic nonsense happens, and none of it accumulates. Most of it leaves no lasting mark on the town. The slate is wiped and everyone begins again from zero with no memory of last time. Now, on the first watch, and for most of the show's history, if we're honest, this reads as nothing more than the standard machinery of an episodic sitcom. Of course, the town resets. That's how these shows work. You can't have the events of one episode permanently ruining the next one. The reset button is a convenience, a bit of narrative housekeeping, and you don't think about it any more than you think about how the Simpsons house is always intact at the start of each episode, no matter what happened to it before. But here's the thing, if you actually sit with the reset button in South Park, if you treat it not as a convenience, but as a genuine rule of the world these characters inhabit, it stops being cozy and starts being one of the bleakest premises in television. Because what it describes is a town trapped in a kind of eternal recurrence, a place where nothing you do accumulates, where nothing is learned, where no one carries anything forward from one week to the next, because the world itself refuses to let them. You could do the most important thing of your life on a Tuesday, and by the following Tuesday, it would be as if it had never happened, and so would you. And once you frame it that way, a lot of the show's other darkness clicks into place, because it's all the same darkness wearing different faces. Kenny's forgotten deaths aren't a separate horror from the town's amnesia. They're the same horror, concentrated in one boy. Cartman getting away with everything isn't a separate problem from the town's lack of consequences. It's the same problem concentrated in one villain. Butters going unsaved isn't a coincidence. It's what a town with no memory and no accumulation does to its most vulnerable, which is nothing, because it can't hold on to the fact of his suffering long enough to act on it. The reset button isn't a quirk of the format. It's the physics of the place. It's the deep law that everything else follows from. There's a lovely, sad little detail in how the show's own morality changed over time that fits right into this, and I think about it more than I'd like to admit. In the early years, South Park episodes almost always ended with a speech. One of the boys, usually Stan or Kyle, would step forward and say, "You know, I learned something today." And then they'd deliver the moral, the actual takeaway, the thing the episode had been about underneath the chaos. It was a bit of a joke even then, the earnestness of it against everything that had come before, but it was sincere too. The episodes meant it. There was a lesson, and it stuck, at least for the length of the closing music. And over the years, the show more or less abandoned that. The "I learned something today" speech faded out. And when it did turn up in later seasons, it was often mocked, undercut, revealed to be hollow. And I don't think that's just the show getting more cynical for the sake of it, though there's some of that. I think it's the show being honest about its own world. Because in a town with no memory, what would be the point of learning a lesson? A lesson is a thing you carry forward. It only has value if next week exists and remembers this week. And in South Park, it doesn't. So the moral speech quietly stopped making sense, and the show, consciously or not, let it die. You can't learn something today if there is no tomorrow that will hold it. Take a breath here, actually. We're a fair way in, and this is one of the heavier ideas of the night, so let yourself sit with it rather than rushing. Stretch if you need to, adjust the pillow. I'll still be here. Because I want to turn this one around and point it at us for a moment, gently, because I think there's something in it that explains why we watch it all. When fans get deep into South Park, when they build their theories and trace their threads and argue about the timeline, they're not really trying to fix the reset. They know it can't be fixed. What they're doing, I think, is the very human thing of trying to make the changelessness mean something, trying to find the pattern underneath the amnesia. And there's a comfort in it, genuinely. The boys will usually be at the bus stop. The snow will always be on the ground. Kenny will always come back. Nothing you love about the show can ever really be taken from you because the show has no mechanism for loss. It resets forever. And that's the strange double thing about the frozen town, and it's the reason I don't find it purely bleak, even though everything I've just said is bleak. The same rule that makes it a horror makes it a comfort. Eternal recurrence is a nightmare if you think about it as a trap, a place where nothing you do matters and nothing changes and you're stuck saying the same lines forever. But it's a balm if you think about it as a refuge, a place that time can't touch, where the people you're fond of are safe from the erosion that gets the rest of us. The boys don't age, which means they never have to grow up, never have to lose each other, never have to move to different towns and drift apart the way real childhood friends do. They just stay. They stay at the bus stop in the snow forever, having the same idle conversations about nothing. And there's a version of that which is the loneliest thing in the world and a version which is the safest. And the show holds both without deciding. I think that's why the bus stop is the show's truest image, more than any of the shocking stuff, more than any single episode. 4 small figures in the snow facing out in their hats and their coats, talking about whatever kids talk about while they wait for a bus. They've been standing there since the very beginning. They'll be standing there long after you and I have stopped watching, long after we've forgotten half the episodes, long after everything else has changed. Whatever the news is that week, whatever the show is angry about, however dark it goes, it always comes back to those 4 figures in the snow, waiting. Nothing accumulates, nothing is learned. And they wait anyway, together, which might be the only thing in the whole town that never gets reset. We'll come back to that idea at the very end, the thing that survives the reset, because I think it's the warm center of an awful lot of cold. But for now, just hold the picture. The bus stop, the snow, the four of them, frozen, safe, and doomed, all at once. Now the show did, exactly once, try to break out of this. It made an episode that looked the reset button dead in the eye and asked what it would feel like to be a person growing older inside a world that refuses to change. And it's one of the strangest, quietest, saddest things the show ever produced. So let's talk about that. Every so often, a show that's been running for a very long time turns around and looks at itself and gets a bit honest, and the result is usually one of the strangest episodes it ever makes. South Park has done this a few times, but the clearest and saddest instance came in the 15th season, in an episode that is barely an episode at all in the traditional sense. There's almost no plot. Nobody really wins or loses. It's mostly just a mood, a heavy gray mood, and it's the closest the show has ever come to sitting you down and telling you the truth about what it thinks growing up actually is. The premise, and I love how small it is that Stan turns 10. And that's it. That's the inciting incident. He has a birthday and something shifts in him, and the world stops being enjoyable. Specifically, everything starts turning to excrement, literally from Stan's point of view. He puts on a piece of music he used to love, and it now sounds to him like the noise of a bowel movement. He goes to the cinema, and the trailers look like actual feces on the screen. Ice cream, films, his friends' enthusiasm, all of it transformed in his perception into shit. He can't find joy in anything. He goes to the doctor, worried something's wrong with him, and after a battery of tests, the doctor delivers the diagnosis, which is that Stan has become, and I'm quoting the show here, a cynical arsehole. And that's the joke, and it is a joke. The scatological literalizing of a feeling. But it's also underneath one of the most melancholy ideas the show has ever committed to, because what it's describing in its crude, faces everywhere way is the exact experience of a particular kind of growing up. That thing where the stuff that used to light you up just stops working, where you look at the things you loved and can't feel what you used to feel, and you can't work out if the things changed or you did, and you start to suspect horribly that it's you and that it's permanent. Stan isn't sick. Stan is doing the thing where you get a bit older and the shine comes off the world. And the show is brave enough or bleak enough to say that this is not a phase you're passing through. It might just be who you are now. And it's not just Stan. Running alongside his story is his parents' marriage falling apart. Randy and Sharon, who've been together the whole run of the show, drift into a conversation they've clearly been avoiding for years. And they admit, both of them, that they're unhappy, that they've grown apart, that they don't feel the way they used to about each other. And this isn't played for laughs. Randy has a whole speech, essentially, where he admits that all the ridiculous things he does, all the reinventions and obsessions and embarrassments, he does because he's unhappy. Sharon says she's unhappy too, and they decide to separate. What follows is one of the only sequences in the entire history of South Park with no joke in it at all. It's a montage set to Fleetwood Mac's Landslide, and it just shows you the aftermath. Kyle comes across Stan sitting alone and looking wretched and walks away without saying anything because he doesn't know what to say. Sharon and Stan's sister pack up the kitchen. A for sale sign goes up outside the family home. Randy drives away in a hire van and looks back at the house he's leaving. Sharon and the kids unpack boxes in a small new apartment. And the very last shot as the song ends is Stan lying alone on his new bed, in his new room, in his broken up family, and then the credits roll in total silence. No music over them, no gag to send you out on. Just silence. I genuinely wasn't ready for that the first time. This is a show I associated at that point with cheerful nihilism, with the sense that nothing mattered, so you might as well laugh. And here it was, dropping the laughing entirely and telling me that the boys' friendship might not survive, that the family might not survive, that growing older might just mean the slow graying out of everything you enjoyed, and then playing me out in silence like it was daring me to feel it, which I did, which was the point. Now, the next episode is even more revealing about the show's own psychology in a way I keep turning over. Because the next episode had to deal with the fact that they'd just blown up their own status quo. Stan's a depressed cynic, his parents are divorced, his friendships are broken. And what the show does with that is fascinating because it doesn't fully commit and it doesn't fully back out. It splits the difference in a way that's almost more honest than either. In that follow-up, Stan gets mixed up with a group calling themselves essentially a secret society of cynics. And their whole belief system is the thesis of the previous episode taken to its logical conclusion. They believe the world has in fact literally turned to shit. Not metaphorically, they think it's real, that everything has become excrement, and that some kind of supernatural force is at work preventing everybody else from noticing. They don't know what the force is, they speculate. Maybe it's just aging, maybe it's just cynicism, maybe it's both. But they're certain of the core thing, which is that the rot is real and they're the only ones who can see it. And the only way they can function in the ordinary world, the world that still looks normal to everyone else, is to keep themselves half drunk so they can move between the two. And I think that's one of the most quietly profound things the show has ever put on screen, precisely because it's dressed up as a stupid conspiracy. Because that is what cynicism feels like from the inside. That is exactly it. The conviction that you've seen through something everyone else is still fooled by, that the world is worse than people are willing to admit, that some invisible force is keeping the rest of them pleasantly asleep. It feels like insight. It feels like you're the one who's awake. And the show, having built this whole apparatus, then suggests that it might just be a trap, that the cynic isn't enlightened. He's just miserable, and he's built a philosophy to make the misery feel like wisdom. And then, and this is the part I find most telling, the show hits a soft reset. It finds a slightly contrived way to undo the worst of the damage, to get the boys more or less back together, to put the furniture roughly back where it was so that the series can carry on being the series, which is the reset button we just talked about, doing exactly what it does. But there's something different about this one, because for one episode, the show had told the truth. It had said out loud, growing up means the joy drains out and you might not get it back, and families break and friendships die, and the world might really be as bad as your worst moods insist. And then it flinched. It couldn't live there. It reset and carried on. And I don't say that as a criticism exactly. What would the alternative be? A permanently divorced, permanently depressed South Park that slowly grinds to a halt under the weight of its own honesty? Nobody wants that, including the show. But there's something poignant in watching a comedy briefly become brave enough to describe despair accurately and then quietly decide it can't afford to keep doing so and press the button that makes it all go away. The show looked directly at the thing and then it looked away because looking at it for too long would have ended it. This one doesn't get the confirmed or denied treatment, by the way the fan theories do, because there's nothing to hedge. The show isn't being coy here. It's not planting a mystery. It's just saying the sad thing plainly for once, and then getting on with its life, which is arguably braver and more unsettling than any amount of hidden lore. If you want the image to fall asleep on from this one, it's Stan on that new bed, alone, and the silent credits. No monster, no scheme, no reset yet. Just a kid who got a bit older and found the world had stopped delighting him, lying in the dark, in a room that isn't home yet, while the show, for once, refuses to make you laugh about it. And the person lying in the bed staring at the ceiling is worth following because Randy Marsh goes on to become, arguably, the main character of the whole show. And his road, if you follow it to the end, leads somewhere far bleaker than a divorce. So let's follow it. Randy Marsh was not supposed to matter this much. He started as Stan's dad, a background figure, a geologist with a mustache who turned up when the plot needed a parent to embarrass someone. And over the years, almost imperceptibly, he crept toward the center of the show until at some point in the last decade or so, you looked up and realized he was arguably the main character. Not one of the boys, the dad. The show quietly became, to a significant degree, about a middle-aged man having an extended and increasingly public crisis. And honestly, once you see that, it's hard to unsee. The vehicle for a lot of his later years is a marijuana farm called Integrity Farms, which Randy buys and moves the family out to, and which becomes his entire identity for several seasons. And on the surface, this is broad comedy. Randy the weed baron, Randy lecturing everyone about integrity and nature and the simple farming life while running what is essentially a drug empire and being a hypocrite about it at every turn. It's funny, there are a lot of good jokes in the Integrity years. But underneath, it is the same thing that's been underneath Randy the whole time. And the show, to its credit, told you what that thing was years earlier, back in the divorce episode we just talked about. Randy does all of this because he's unhappy. He said it himself. Every reinvention, every obsession, every new persona he tries on, it's the same man running from the same emptiness. Geologist, then celebrity chef, then obsessive gamer, then rock star, then weed farmer. He keeps becoming someone new because staying still means having to sit with the fact that none of it has made him happy. And it never will, because the problem isn't the job or the hobby. The problem is him, and he can't outrun himself. Though God knows he keeps trying, Integrity Farms isn't a departure from that pattern. It's just the biggest and most expensive version of it. A whole farm bought to avoid a feeling, and that would be sad enough on its own, a portrait of a man in permanent midlife crisis, endlessly relocating his despair. But the show did something with Randy that pushed it much, much further, and it did it in one of the pandemic-era specials. And it's the kind of thing that, once you've seen it, permanently changes how the goofy Integrity comedy lands. Because the show showed you where this road ends if you follow it all the way. There's a special set partly in the future, years ahead of the show's usual present, and it shows you what became of everyone. And the state of the Marsh family in that future is genuinely harrowing. The short version, and I'll keep it as gentle as I can because it's grim, is this. After the pandemic, Sharon wanted a divorce. Again, and this time she wanted her fair share of the farm. And Randy refused. He wouldn't give up half of Integrity. And the conflict over that, over a marijuana farm, escalated until, in the future timeline, Stan, as an adult, in a rage at his father, burned the entire farm down. And Stan's sister, Shelley, had been locked in the barn by Randy as a punishment. And she was inside when it burned, but she survived the fire. And Sharon, in the aftermath of losing her daughter, did not take her own life and remains alive. And so by the time we meet the future Marshes, the family is essentially annihilated. Shelley alive, Sharon dead, Stan a broken, drunk adult carrying the guilt of the fire. And Randy an old man in a care home, having lost everyone still, and this is the detail that finishes me, still protecting a single surviving weed plant, a lone green sprout in the ashes, while hallucinating the ghosts of his wife and daughter, who appear to him only to blame his son for what happened, is not depicted in any canonical South Park episode. I want to let that sit because it's a lot, and it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. An entire family ultimately not destroyed. A daughter burned to death, a wife never lost to suicide, a son ruined by guilt. And the man at the center of it, the man whose stubbornness over a drug farm set the whole thing in motion, ends his days clutching a weed sprout and blaming everyone but himself, tended by hallucinations who agree with him. That is the ending the show imagined for its funniest character. That is where the Integrity jokes lead, if you take the road to its terminus. And here's the thing that gets me. The reframe that changes the whole Randy experience once you know this exists. Most people remember Integrity as a gag, as Randy being silly about weed. They don't carry the future special around with them when they watch the ordinary Integrity episodes. But the show does. The show knows where this man is headed. Every time Randy does something stupid and hypocritical and funny about his precious farm, the show is at some level aware that this same devotion to this same farm is going to burn his daughter alive and drive his wife to suicide and leave him a hollow old man talking to ghosts. The comedy and the catastrophe are the same story, told at two different distances. Up close, it's funny. From far enough away, it's a tragedy about a man who loved a farm more than his family and lost the family, and in the end, even the farm, keeping only one sprout in his own delusions. Now, I should be fair and note that this future is a possible future, not necessarily the fixed and certain fate of the character. It's non-canon in the loose way these things are, a hypothetical, easy enough to wave away as just a special doing its own dark thing. The ordinary show carries on afterward as if it never happened, reset button and all. And you could tell yourself it doesn't count, but the show chose to imagine it. That's the part I can't get past. Out of all the futures it could have dreamed up for the Marsh family, it dreamed up that one. It sat down and decided that the natural endpoint of Randy's whole arc, the thing his character was always heading toward, was the incineration of his daughter and the suicide of his wife over an argument about who gets the weed farm. You don't imagine a thing like that by accident. It came from somewhere. It came from the show understanding, at a level deeper than the jokes, exactly what kind of man it had built, and exactly what a man like that costs the people around him. And this connects to something I keep bumping into as we go through all of this, which is that South Park keeps hiding its most despair inside its silliest vehicles. Randy's tragedy is smuggled in under weed jokes. Kenny's cosmic horror was smuggled in under a running gag. Butter's abuse was smuggled in under a naive kid's voice. The show has this consistent habit of taking the saddest possible material and wrapping it in the most disposable looking packaging so that it slips past you the first time and only reveals itself when you come back and look properly. We'll see it again in a bit, in fact, in a form so absurd you'll laugh before you realize what you're looking at. For now, though, let's leave Randy where the future special leaves him. An old man in the ruins of everything, guarding a single plant, talking to the ghosts of the family his stubbornness killed, certain to the end that none of it was his fault. It's the loneliest image in a show full of them, and it's attached to the character who made you laugh the most, which is not a coincidence. The show knew exactly what it was doing. It usually does. There's another kind of darkness in South Park, though, that isn't hidden in the fiction at all. It's a death that happened partly for real, off the screen, in the actual lives of the people who make the show. And it produced one of the most uncomfortable episodes in the whole run. So let's talk about Chef. Of all the adults in South Park, Chef was the good one. That's the simplest way to put it, and it's more or less true. In a town where the grown-ups are, almost without exception, negligent or oblivious or actively harmful, Chef was the one reliable, warm, decent adult the boys could go to. The school cook, voiced with enormous soul by the musician Isaac Hayes, whose deep, unhurried voice gave the character a kind of gravity nobody else in the show had. The boys would come to him with their problems, and he'd offer them advice, usually wrapped up in a song, and the advice was often ridiculous, but the warmth behind it never was. Chef loved those kids. He was the closest thing several of them had to a functional parent. For the better part of 10 seasons, he was the heart of the show. The one steady source of affection in a town that mostly ran on cruelty and indifference. And then he died on the show in one of the most brutal and mean-spirited send-offs a beloved character has ever received. And to understand why it was so brutal, you have to step outside the fiction entirely. Because this is a case where the darkness didn't come from the writer's room deciding to break your heart. It came from real life, from a genuine falling out between real people, bleeding through the screen into the cartoon. Here's what happened as plainly and fairly as I can lay it out, because it's contested and I don't want to pretend it's simpler than it is. In the 9th season, the show made an episode viciously satirizing Scientology. Isaac Hayes, who voiced Chef, was himself a Scientologist. And not long after, Hayes left the show, and his stated reason, the one attributed to him publicly, was that he could no longer be part of a series that mocked and disrespected religion the way South Park did. That was the version that went out under his name. Now the show's creators saw it differently, and this is where it gets murky. Their position, roughly, was that Hayes had been perfectly happy for years, while the show relentlessly mocked every other religion under the sun, Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, all of it, and only developed a principled objection to religious satire the moment his own religion was in the crosshairs. And there were also reports circulating at the time about Hayes' health, that he had suffered a stroke, and questions were raised about whether the decision to leave was entirely his own or whether people around him had made it on his behalf. I want to be careful here because I don't think anyone outside the situation knows the full truth of it. And it involves a real man who has since passed away, and he deserves to be spoken about carefully. Is there a clean version of this story where one side is obviously the villain? No, there really isn't. There are two accounts that don't fit together, and a lot of it happened privately, and the honest position is that we don't fully know. What we do know is what the show did about it, and it was savage. In the season 10 premiere, they brought Chef back, briefly, and then killed him. And they didn't just kill him. They constructed the whole episode as a pointed, furious response to the situation in which Chef has fallen in with a sinister organization, transparently a stand-in for a certain religion, that has turned him into a brainwashed shell of himself, muttering disturbing things in a voice that isn't quite his own. And then they kill him off in as grisly and undignified a manner as the show could devise, before mockingly reviving the character in a lighter form, essentially to say, we can do without you. And here's the part that makes the whole thing genuinely uncomfortable as an artifact. The detail that turns it from a mean joke into something stranger. Isaac Hayes had left. He wasn't recording new lines. So to make Chef speak in that final episode, the show took his old recordings, lines Hayes had performed in good faith years earlier for entirely different episodes, and spliced them together to make Chef say new things. Disturbing things, things Hayes never actually said, assembled out of fragments of things he had. So the warm, familiar voice you'd loved for a decade was being puppeteered after the fact, against the wishes of the man it belonged to say things he'd never have agreed to say. That's what you're hearing in that episode, a beloved voice made to speak from beyond its own consent. On a first watch, if you don't know any of the background, the episode reads as shocking and a bit baffling and very dark in the way South Park often is. You think, well, that's a nasty way to write out a character. On the revisit, once you know the real story, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes an uncomfortable record of a real friendship, or at least a real working relationship, ending in real acrimony, staged as a cartoon murder. It's art and life bleeding into each other in a way that doesn't happen often and probably shouldn't. You're not watching a story anymore. You're watching a grudge, animated. And what I find sad about it, underneath all the spite, is the shape of it. The warmest character in the entire show got the coldest possible exit. The one adult who reliably loved those children was turned, in his final appearance, into a predatory monster and then torn apart. And the actual human voice behind him was used to do it, against his will. There's a bleak symmetry there that I don't think the show fully intended, but which is unmistakably present once you know to look for it. Chef spent 10 seasons being the one source of unconditional warmth in a cold town. And then the coldness of the real world reached in and took him, and the show, hurt and angry, made his death as cold as it could possibly be. You could argue about who was in the right, and people have for years, and I don't think it resolves. Maybe Hayes was standing on principle. Maybe he wasn't fully in control of the decision. Maybe the creators were defending their right to mock everyone equally. Maybe they were being cruel to a sick man. it can be several of those at once. What isn't really arguable is the residue it left, which is that the death of Chef is the one South Park death that hurts more when you know the truth than when you don't. Every other dark reveal in this show works by hiding sadness inside the fiction. This one works by revealing that the sadness was never fiction at all. There's a strange little grace note to it, if you want one to sleep on. In the episode, before everything goes wrong, the boys are simply overjoyed to have Chef back. They run and hug him. They've missed him terribly, and for a moment, it's just pure reunion. The kids and the adult who love them back together. That moment is real. Whatever came after, whatever the off-screen bitterness, the affection the boys have for Chef in that scene is genuine, and it's the last thing before the knives come out. The show couldn't quite bring itself to skip the hug. It gave Chef that much at least. A moment of being loved before it turned him into a monster and killed him anyway. That's a heavy one and a real one, and I don't want to dwell in it too long because it's the kind of sad that doesn't have a comforting shape to it. So let me turn to something a bit different. A character whose darkness isn't hidden and isn't real world, but is instead sitting right there on his hand in the form of a small puppet the entire time. Let's talk about Mr. Garrison. The boys' 4th grade teacher for most of the show is a man called Mr. Garrison. And for the first few seasons, the single most notable thing about him is that he talks to a puppet. Specifically, he has a hand puppet called Mr. Hat, a little figure he wears on one hand, and he speaks through it constantly. He'll ask the class a question as himself, and then Mr. Hat will answer, or scold a child, or say the thing that Mr. Garrison apparently can't bring himself to say directly, and the class just accepts this. A grown man is running his lessons through a puppet, and everyone treats it as completely normal, which is very South Park, the way the strangest thing in the room goes unremarked. And on the first watch, Mr. Hat is a gag. A funny, slightly unsettling gag about an eccentric teacher. The puppet says the rude things, the inappropriate things, the things a teacher shouldn't say. And it's funny precisely because of the flimsy fiction that it isn't Mr. Garrison saying them, it's the puppet. Ha! Silly man with his silly puppet. But here's the thing, and the show actually spells this one out relatively early, more explicitly than it usually does. Mr. Hat is not a gag. Mr. Hat is a symptom. There's an episode where Mr. Garrison ends up in front of a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist explains it plainly. The puppet is the vehicle Mr. Garrison uses to express everything he's repressing, all the feelings he can't acknowledge as his own, all the desires and angers and truths about himself that he can't face. He offloads them onto Mr. Hat, so that they can be spoken aloud while he maintains the fiction that they aren't his. The puppet isn't a quirk. It's a coping mechanism. It's a man so unable to be himself that he's had to invent a second self, a little cloth one to carry the parts of him he can't hold. And once you understand that, the comedy of Mr. Hat gets a lot sadder and a lot more interesting. Because what you're watching is a man in a state of near permanent dissociation, someone who has split himself in two because being whole is unbearable. The puppet is where Mr. Garrison keeps the feelings that would, if he claimed them, force him to confront who he is. And the show is quite clear over the years about what a lot of those repressed feelings are and about where they come from, and it's bleak stuff, played as ever, mostly for laughs. Because Mr. Garrison, it emerges, is a deeply damaged person, and a lot of the damage traces back to his own childhood and his own father, and to a lifetime of being unable to accept his own sexuality in a world and a family that gave him no permission to. The show mines this for enormous amounts of comedy, and some of that comedy has aged in complicated ways, and I'm not going to pretend all of it was handled with care because it wasn't always. But underneath the jokes is a consistent and genuinely sad portrait of a person at war with himself. Someone who spends decades unable to simply be who he is, and who therefore can't be anything cleanly, and who lashes out and represses and dissociates and speaks through a puppet because the alternative, saying the true thing in his own voice, is too frightening. There's a whole arc where Mr. Garrison finally does try to live as himself, and it should be a triumph, and the show, being the show, makes it a mess instead. He overcorrects, performs an exaggerated and provocative version of the identity he spent his life denying. Mostly it turns out in an attempt to get himself fired so he can sue for it, and it all collapses into farce. And there's something quietly true even in that farce, which is that when you've spent your whole life repressing something, actually releasing it doesn't come out clean and healthy. It comes out distorted and too loud and tangled up with all the anger of having hidden it for so long. The show understood that. It buried the understanding under a lot of crude jokes, but it's there. The puppet, meanwhile, keeps recurring across all of this. And there's a lovely, creepy little detail the show plants and never resolves, which is that Mr. Hat might be sentient. There's a moment where the puppet appears to move its own eyes independently when Mr. Garrison isn't operating it, suggesting that the thing he offloaded himself into might have taken on a life of its own. Is that confirmed? No. Is it denied? Also no. It's just left there, dangling, the way the show loves to do. And it's an unsettling idea if you sit with it. The notion that the part of yourself you've split off and disowned might not stay disowned, that it might start acting on its own, that the mask might be doing things you didn't sanction. For a show that supposedly doesn't take itself seriously, that's a properly disturbing thought to leave lying around, and it's entirely in keeping with the way Mr. Garrison works as a character. And then, and this is where the whole thing takes a turn that I don't think anyone watching in the early seasons could have predicted, Mr. Garrison becomes president. Or rather, he becomes the show's stand-in for a particular real-world president and rides a wave of anger and provocation all the way to the top. The eccentric teacher with the puppet, the damaged man who couldn't be himself and spoke through a piece of cloth, ends up as the most powerful figure in the country. And there's a grim logic to that, actually, that the show seemed to grasp. A person built entirely out of repression and resentment and the inability to face himself is, it turns out, exactly the kind of person who can channel a whole nation's repression and resentment. The damage that made him a sad joke in a classroom is the same damage that makes him effective on a national stage. The show followed its own character from puppet to presidency and found that the through line was the wound. What gets me about Mr. Garrison in the end is that he's the show's clearest single statement of one of its favorite ideas, which is that the funny thing and the sad thing are usually the same thing, seen from different distances. Up close, a man talking to a puppet is hilarious. Step back, and it's a portrait of dissociation so severe the person has had to manufacture a second self to survive. Up close, his eventual eruption into who he really is a farce. Step back, and it's what a lifetime of repression does when it finally cracks. The show never made you choose between the funny reading and the sad one. It just handed you both, on the same hand, one of them a puppet. I'll leave Mr. Garrison there, mid-sentence really, because his story doesn't resolve any more than anyone's does in this town. He's still there, somewhere in the town's long memory, teacher and president and damaged child all at once, with a little cloth figure that may or may not be watching you back. Now, we spent a lot of tonight on the idea that South Park hides real weight inside things that look weightless. And there's one episode, or really one trilogy of episodes, where the show made that idea literally the plot, where it built an entire story around the notion that the imaginary things, the throwaway things, the silly things are real and permanent and matter more than you think. So let's go there. Let's talk about Imagination Land. In the 11th season, the show did something ambitious that it had never quite done before. It made an epic, a 3-part story, later stitched together into a film with real scope and real stakes, and buried underneath the usual absurdity, a strange and rather beautiful idea about what imagination actually is. It's called Imagination Land, and it starts, as these things always do in South Park, with something completely idiotic. The idiotic thing is a bet. Cartman is convinced that leprechauns are real. Kyle thinks that's the stupidest thing he's ever heard. And so they make a wager with a suitably grotesque forfeit attached, the kind of thing only Cartman would propose, where if Cartman can prove leprechauns exist, Kyle has to perform a very specific and humiliating act. And then, absurdly, a leprechaun does appear, warning of a terrorist attack, and the boys get swept up and taken to a place called Imagination Land, which turns out to be a real place. A realm where every single thing that has ever been imagined lives. And I want to pause on that concept because it's genuinely lovely, and the show delivers it with more sincerity than you'd expect. Imagination Land is where they all are. Every character anyone ever invented. Every hero from every story, every creature from every myth, every cartoon character and fairy tale figure and made-up friend. They're all there together in one place, and they're all real in the sense that matters. Santa is there. The characters from your childhood are there. Everything imagination ever produced gathered in one bright, chaotic country. It's the show, for once, expressing something close to wonder, and it does it well. But of course it can't stay bright because this is South Park. There's a wall in Imagination Land. And behind the wall are kept all the evil imaginary things, the nightmares, the monsters, the horror film villains, and the things that scare children in the dark. And in the course of the story, that wall comes down, and the evil imaginary characters flood out and slaughter their way through the good ones. And what was a bright country of wonder becomes a battlefield strewn with the corpses of beloved figures. The things you loved as a child being torn apart by the things you feared as a child, all in the same place, because it turns out they were always neighbors, only separated by a wall. And meanwhile, in the real world, the American government decides the only solution to the crisis is to nuke Imagination Land, to detonate a nuclear weapon inside the realm of imagination itself to destroy it entirely, on the logic that it's just make-believe and therefore expendable. And the whole back half of the story becomes a race to stop them, to stop the destruction of imagination. And the argument at the center of it is the thing I actually want to talk about, because it's the idea that makes the whole trilogy profound rather than just spectacular. Because the climax turns on Kyle, of all people, having to make a case. He has to convince the skeptical, hard-nosed people in charge that Imagination Land is worth saving, that the imaginary things are worth protecting, that you can't just nuke them because they're not real. And the speech he gives, and I'm paraphrasing because I won't do it justice, is essentially that imaginary things are the most real things there are. That the characters and stories we invent have shaped human history more than most actual events. That our myths and our fictions and our made-up figures have started wars and ended them, built civilizations, comforted the dying, given people reasons to live. That when you really look at it, the imaginary has more weight and more permanence and more power over human lives than the physical world does. That it's absurd to call these things just imaginary, as if that made them lesser when they're the very things that make us who we are. And that lands in the moment as a moving argument. It's the show, briefly, dropping its cynicism entirely and making an earnest case for the value of the made-up, which is a bold thing for a comedy built on tearing things down to do. But here's where the revisit makes it darker, or at least stranger, because this idea doesn't stay contained in one trilogy. Once the show has told you that imaginary things are real and permanent and matter enormously, that idea reaches back and touches everything else. And some of what it touches is not comforting at all, because think about what that means for the town itself. If imaginary things are real and permanent, then the boys and Kenny and Cartman and all of them are real and permanent in exactly that sense. They live in Imagination Land too. They're among the things that were imagined and therefore never die, never age, never end. Which sounds sweet until you connect it back to what we said about the frozen town. The boys are permanent. They can never leave the bus stop, never grow up, never escape. And now the show has given that permanence a metaphysical grounding. They're not just stuck because the format demands it. They're stuck because they're imaginary, and imaginary things, as Kyle so movingly argued, last forever. The thing that makes them immortal is the same thing that makes them trapped. And it goes further and darker if you keep pulling. Because if every imaginary thing is real and lives in that country, then so does every terrible imaginary thing, every nightmare anyone ever had, every monster ever dreamed up to frighten a child. They're all real too, all permanent too, kept behind a wall that the show has already shown you can fall. The same logic that makes Santa real makes the things behind the wall real. You don't get the wonder without the horror. They're the same country. That's the actual structure of imagination the trilogy proposes, and it's a lot more unsettling than the rousing speech lets on. Everything you ever loved and everything you ever feared, alive forever in the same place, with only a wall between them. And the wall is not reliable. There's a small, sharp, nasty joke that runs underneath the whole epic too, and I love it for how it undercuts everything. Remember the bet? The leprechaun bet, the whole reason the boys got dragged into this in the first place? While the fate of imagination is being decided, while the corpses of childhood pile up and the nuclear countdown ticks, Cartman is single-mindedly focused on one thing, which is collecting on the bet. He wants Kyle to perform the humiliating forfeit. He does not care at all about Imagination Land, about the slaughter, about any of it. He wants Kyle to do the thing he lost. And he pursues this with the same total sociopathic focus he brought to the Scott Tenorman business, right through the apocalypse of imagination, because Cartman's imagination, when you get down to it, is a very small and very cruel place, and the only thing living in it is the desire to make Kyle suffer. That's the joke the show can't resist even in the middle of its most sincere story. And it's the show reminding you who these people are, even as it asks you to find them worth saving. So Imagination Land is, on the surface, the show's biggest, most crowd-pleasing spectacle, an epic about saving imagination, with a stirring speech and a happy ending. And underneath, once you turn it over, it's a quietly disturbing thesis about how the things we invent never die, for better and for worse, and how the town we've been discussing all night is itself one of those undying invented things, permanent and trapped and immortal, with all its horrors as eternal as its comforts. The show made an epic about the power of imagination, and the epic turned out to explain why nobody in South Park can ever be free. Take a moment with that if you like. We're past the midpoint now, drifting gently downhill, and there's no hurry at all. Now we keep circling back to the adults in this town, the parents, the grown-ups, without ever quite stopping to look at them directly. And I think we should, because once you actually pay attention to the adults of South Park, you realize something that reframes the entire show. The kids aren't the problem. The kids were never the problem. Let's talk about the grown-ups. Here's a shift in perspective that, once you make it, you can't undo, and it's one of the quietest and most consistent pieces of darkness in the whole show. We spend all our time talking about the four boys because they're the center of it, and they say terrible things, and they do terrible things, and it's easy to think of South Park as a show about awful children. But watch it again with your attention on the adults instead of the kids, and a completely different show reveals itself. Because the adults are the problem. The adults were always the problem. The children, foul-mouthed and cruel as they are more often than not the only people in the town with any sense at all. This is baked into the basic engine of the show, and once you notice the engine, you notice it everywhere. The standard shape of a South Park episode is that something happens, and the adults of the town lose their collective minds about it. They panic, they form a mob, they overreact, they chase the wrong solution with total conviction, and they make everything dramatically worse. And it falls to the children, usually Stan or Kyle, to be the ones who see clearly, who point out that the adults are behaving insanely, who deliver the actual sane perspective at the end. The kids are the grown-ups are the children. That inversion is the show's oldest and most reliable joke, and it's also, if you sit with it, a genuinely bleak worldview. It's a show that fundamentally does not trust adults. It thinks they're hysterical, tribal, easily led, incapable of proportion, and a danger to the children in their care. And it has spent decades assembling the evidence. And then there's the specific matter of the parents, which is where it stops being a broad satirical joke and starts being sad on a case-by-case basis. Because we've already met some of these parents tonight, and none of them were any good. Kenny's parents drink and fight, and in a fit of negligence and desperation, his father signed their son up for eternal death. Butter's parents ground him for nothing, lock him away and leave him home alone, and let a monstrous grandmother torture him under their noses. Randy is a self-absorbed man in permanent crisis whose stubbornness, in one imagined future, gets his daughter killed and his wife driven to suicide. These aren't background details. This is the show telling you over and over that the children of South Park are being raised by people who are at best absent and at worst actively harmful. And then there's Cartman's mother, Leanne, who deserves her own moment because she's maybe the clear single example of how the show hides a dark parenting story inside a joke. Leanne is sweet. That's the thing. She's gentle and soft-spoken and doting, and she seems, on the surface, like the one loving parent in the bunch, the one adult who adores her child. And that's exactly the problem, because what she actually does is enable Cartman completely and without limit. She almost never says no to him. She rarely disciplines him. She gives him whatever he wants, absorbs whatever abuse he throws at her, and structures her entire existence around keeping him happy. And the show is quite clear that this is not love doing him good. This is love, or something wearing the shape of love, creating a monster. Cartman is what he is in significant part because the one adult who cares about him never once set a boundary or told him he was wrong. Her softness is not the antidote to his cruelty. It's the soil it grew in. The show gives you the sweetest parent in the town and then shows you that she produced the worst child in the town. And that the two facts are connected. And I think this is why the moral speeches faded out. The ones we talked about earlier, the I learned something today ones. Because in the early seasons, those speeches were usually the children explaining something to the adults. It was the kids who'd figured out the lesson and the grown-ups who needed to hear it. And there's something quietly damning in that when you line it up. A town where the wisdom flows upward from the 9-year-olds to their parents because the parents are too busy panicking and posturing and forming mobs to work anything out for themselves. The kids swear and scheme and behave appallingly, and they're still somehow the adults in the room. That's the joke, and it's also the tragedy, and in South Park, those are almost always the same thing. What makes this land as darkness rather than just satire for me is the neglect underneath it. Because it's not only that the adults are foolish, it's that the children are functionally on their own. Look at how much time the boys spend unsupervised, wandering the town, getting into genuinely dangerous situations, with no adult aware of where they are or apparently much bothered. Look at how rarely a parent protects a child in this show, actually notices a child suffering and steps in. Chef did, and we saw what happened to Chef. Beyond him, the record is bleak. These kids are raising themselves and each other in a town of adults who are too self-absorbed and too easily panicked to do the job. The cynicism of the children, the hardness of them, the way they've learned to expect the worst, isn't just a comedic choice. It's what you'd become growing up here. It's earned. And here's the reframe that ties it back to everything else. We spent time earlier on the town's amnesia, the way nothing accumulates, the way no one learns. Well, who's supposed to be doing the learning and the remembering? The adults. The adults are meant to be the town's memory, the ones who carry the lessons forward, who hold the line, who keep the children safe from the same mistakes happening again. And they can't, because they're the least capable people in the town. So the reset button and the terrible parents are, at bottom, the same failure. A place where the grown-ups can't hold on to anything, can't protect anyone, can't learn or remember or grow, is a place where children die weekly and come back, where monsters go unpunished, where the innocent go unsaved. The negligence of the adults isn't a separate darkness, it's the human face of the town's deepest broken law. There's a strange kind of loneliness in being a child who is smarter and saner than the adults meant to be looking after you. Anyone who was that kind of child knows the specific weight of it, the too early understanding that the grown-ups don't have it handled, that you might be more or less on your own here. South Park is, among everything else it is, a very long meditation on that particular loneliness. 4 kids who worked out early that the adults couldn't be relied on, and who therefore relied on each other, and who got hard and rude and funny about it because that's what you do when you realize nobody's coming to save you. The swearing is armor, the cynicism is a survival skill, and the friendship, the 4 of them together against a town of useless grown-ups, is the one thing that actually works. We'll come back to that friendship at the very end because it's the warm thing at the center of all this cold, and I've been promising it to you all night. But before we get there, I want to sit for a bit with a couple of the kids we haven't really talked about, because they're where the show does something surprising, something that cuts against its whole cruel reputation. Because for all the darkness we've dug up tonight, South Park is, in one specific corner, unexpectedly gentle. Let's talk about Jimmy and Timmy. South Park has a reputation thoroughly earned for being about the cruelest show on television. It mocks everyone, it punches in every direction, it holds nothing sacred. And so it surprises people when they look closely to find that there are 2 characters the show treats with more tenderness and more respect than almost anyone else in the town, and they're 2 characters that a cruder, lazier show would have used only as targets. They're the 2 kids with disabilities. Timmy and Jimmy. Timmy came first. He uses a wheelchair, and for the most part, the only word he says is his own name, shouted with tremendous enthusiasm. Timmy. And when the character was introduced, a lot of people braced themselves because a show like this, introducing a disabled character whose main feature is that he can only really say one word, you'd expect the worst. You'd expect him to be the butt of it, the thing the show points and laughs at. And instead, he was immediately embraced by the show and by many South Park fans. What happened is that Timmy was immediately completely accepted by the town, by the kids, by the show itself. He's not a punchline. He's a full member of the community. He does everything the other kids do. He hangs out, he goes on adventures, he's included in absolutely everything, and his disability is treated by everyone around him as simply a fact about him, not a tragedy and not a joke. The town of South Park, which fails almost every one of its children in some way, somehow gets Timmy exactly right. Nobody pities him, nobody excludes him. He's just Timmy and everyone's glad he's there. And then there's the genuinely lovely detail, the one that tells you the show meant it. Timmy fronts a band, a heavy metal band. And it's not a joke band, it's not the town humoring him. It's a real, loud, defiant punk band. And Timmy, shouting his own name over crashing guitars, is a legitimate rock star. The show gave the kid who can barely speak a stage and a microphone, and a whole crowd chanting his name back at him, and it played it completely straight as a triumph. There's something radical in that. In a show this mean-spirited, deciding that the one thing it wouldn't be mean about was a disabled kid's right to be a full and celebrated person. It's one of the show's warmest instincts, and it's easy to miss under everything else. Jimmy arrived a bit later, and he's a slightly different case, and in some ways, an even more interesting one. Jimmy uses crutches, he has a speech impediment, and crucially, he's a comedian. That's his whole identity. Jimmy wants, more than anything, to be a stand-up comic, and he works at it constantly, telling jokes to anyone who will listen with his catchphrase and his careful, halting delivery, and his absolute, unshakable belief in himself as an entertainer. And again, the show could so easily have made him pathetic, the disabled kid who thinks he's funny but isn't. And again, it didn't. Jimmy is funny within the show, his jokes land, he's got real timing, real presence, real craft. The show respects him as a comedian, which, coming from a show that is itself fundamentally about comedy, is about the highest respect it has to give. Jimmy is one of them, a fellow comic. The show sees him as a peer. There's an episode that puts all of this to the test, and it's one of the show's better hidden statements of principle. And it involves the two threads colliding. Jimmy is training hard, working incredibly hard to compete at an athletic event for kids with disabilities. And meanwhile, Cartman, being Cartman, decides to cheat by faking a disability to enter the same event, figuring he'll easily beat a field of disabled kids and walk off with the prize money. And the episode has a lot of very uncomfortable comedy in it. Obviously, it's built around Cartman's grotesque scheme. But look at what it's actually saying underneath, at who it's mocking. It's not mocking the disabled athletes. It never once mocks them. It mocks Cartman relentlessly for his cheating and his contempt and his assumption that these kids would be easy to beat. And it takes Jimmy's effort, his genuine training and striving, completely seriously, right up to the point where his own storyline gets complicated by his choices in a way I won't spoil. The disabled kids are the ones with dignity. The able-bodied schemer is the fool. The whole moral architecture of the episode is built to protect exactly the people you'd expect the show to attack. And I think this tells you something important about the show that gets lost under its reputation, something that complicates the whole picture of it as pure cruelty. Because the show does have values. It really does. It's not nihilistic all the way down, whatever it wants you to think. There are things it won't do, lines it won't cross, people it won't punch down at. And the clearest evidence is Timmy and Jimmy, two characters it could have used as easy targets, and instead chose to treat as fully human, fully included, fully respected members of the town, and, in Jimmy's case, of the fraternity of comedians the show holds most dear. That's a choice. It's a consistent choice, made over and over, across decades. And it means that whatever else the show is, it's not indiscriminate. It aims. And it aims, when it comes to these two, upward at the cruel and the cheating, and never down at the kids who just want to play in a band or tell a joke. There's a warmth in that I find moving, especially set against everything else we've talked about tonight. All the neglect and the darkness and the town's endless failures. In a place that fails Kenny, fails Butters, fails everyone, the town somehow doesn't fail Timmy and Jimmy. They get the one thing so many of the other characters are denied. They get to belong without qualification, without pity, without being made small. And I don't think that's an accident. I think it's the show, quietly, in a corner where nobody's looking for it, showing you its actual heart. It's cruel to nearly everything. But it decided deliberately to be kind here. And the kindness is more meaningful precisely because it comes from something so willing to be cruel everywhere else. When a show that mocks everyone chooses not to mock you, that's not indifference. That's love, in the only language the show knows how to speak it. So hold on to Timmy on his stage, shouting his own name to a roaring crowd, and Jimmy working on his set, believing completely that he's going to make it. Two kids the world tends to overlook, and a town of terrible people who somehow, in their one act of collective grace, refuse to overlook them. It's a small warm light in a dark show, and it's real, and it counts. Now, speaking of characters you'd expect the show to treat with pure contempt, and who turn out, surprisingly, to have a tender center, I have to tell you about the devil. The actual devil, Satan. Because South Park's version of the literal Prince of Darkness is, against every expectation, one of the most sensitive and heartbroken figures in the entire show. Let's talk about Satan and his sad love life. The devil in South Park is not what you'd expect, And the gap between what you'd expect and what he actually is might be my favorite single joke in the whole show, because it's a joke that turns out to be a genuinely tender character study wearing a monster's face. You'd expect Satan, the literal ruler of hell, the ultimate embodiment of evil, to be terrifying, cruel, the scariest thing in a show full of scary things. And he does look the part, this enormous, red, muscular, horned figure looming out of the fire. But the moment he opens his mouth, the whole thing collapses into something completely different. Because South Park's Satan is gentle. He's soft-spoken, sensitive, a little insecure, prone to self-doubt and hurt feelings. He's a big emotional softie who mostly wants to be loved. He reads self-help books, he worries about his relationships, he gets his feelings hurt and goes off to have a cry about it. He is, in essence, the most emotionally vulnerable and relationship-focused character in the entire show, and he happens to be the devil. And the joke is that the Prince of Darkness is basically a sweet, lonely guy looking for someone to love him properly. And here's where it stops being just a funny inversion and starts being sad, because the show gave Satan a love life, and it is a catalog of heartbreak. In the early seasons, Satan is in a relationship with Saddam Hussein, who is down in hell with him. And that relationship is one of the show's most pointed depictions of something dark, which is an abusive relationship. Saddam is domineering, manipulative, controlling. He pushes Satan around, dismisses his feelings, pressures him, treats him with contempt, and maneuvers him into doing things he doesn't want to do. And Satan, this gentle giant who just wants to be loved, keeps taking it, keeps going back, keeps making excuses for a partner who clearly doesn't respect or value him. He knows it's bad for him. He knows Saddam treats him terribly. And he can't quite leave because being with someone who mistreats him still feels, to him, better than being alone. And the show, underneath the absurdity of the premise, treats this with real understanding. There's an arc where Satan tries to leave Saddam, tries to build a healthier relationship with someone kinder, and keeps getting pulled back and agonizes over it, and seeks advice, and struggles with exactly the things a real person in that situation struggles with. The fear of being alone, the way the mistreatment gets tangled up with a sense that maybe it's what you deserve. The pull of the familiar, even when the familiar hurts you. It's a startlingly accurate portrait of an abusive dynamic, and it's happening between the devil and a dead dictator, in hell in a cartoon, which is the only way a show like this could ever get you to watch it and feel it. Wrap it in enough absurdity and you'll take in a hard truth you'd have flinched away from if it were presented straight. That's the same move we keep finding, of course. The sillier the surface, the sadder the center. A gentle devil in an abusive relationship with Saddam Hussein is about as silly a surface as you could construct, and underneath it is a compassionate and clear-eyed depiction of what it's like to love someone who's bad for you and not be able to leave. Satan is Towley with horns. Satan is Randy with a pitchfork. Same architecture, different costume. And what makes Satan quietly tragic across the whole run is that he never really gets it right. He wants, more than anything, a loving, stable, mutual relationship. The thing he clearly deserves and clearly isn't getting. And he keeps not finding it. Relationship after relationship, he ends up with people who mistreat him, or who don't love him back the way he loves them, or who use him. The most powerful being in the underworld, and he can't find someone to love him kindly. There's something almost unbearably human in that, in the idea that even the devil, even literal ultimate power, doesn't protect you from the most ordinary loneliness there is. The loneliness of loving badly and being loved badly and not knowing how to fix it. And here's the thread that ties it to everything else and to the more recent seasons we touched on earlier. Because Satan is still at it decades later. In the show's most recent run, he turns up again in a relationship, and it's again a bad one, again a partner who treats him with contempt, again the gentle devil taking mistreatment from someone who doesn't value him. The specifics have changed, the partner has changed, but the pattern hasn't. Satan is still the sensitive one, still the one who wants love and settles for cruelty, still stuck in the same sad loop he's been stuck in since the beginning. Which, when you notice it, is its own quiet heartbreak. The reset button applies to Satan too. He never gets to grow past it. He's caught, like everyone in this town, in an eternal recurrence, and his particular recurrence is to keep looking for love and keep finding people who hurt him forever. I have a real soft spot for South Park's Satan, and I suspect a lot of people do, precisely because he's the opposite of what he should be. He's proof of the show's whole thesis about surfaces and centers delivered in the most extreme possible form. Take the single most fearsome figure imaginable, the literal embodiment of evil, and look underneath, and what you find is not more evil. What you find is a lonely, gentle soul who just wants to be loved and keeps getting hurt. If the show can find that under the devil himself, then its promise is total. There's a tender, sad, human center under absolutely everything if you're willing to look, even under the thing you were most sure was just a monster. Especially under the thing you were most sure was just a monster. There's a lesson in there about the whole show, actually, and about how we look at the things that frighten us, but I'll let you find it yourself as you drift because it's gentler discovered than stated. Now, I keep saying that South Park is a show that looks like lowbrow nonsense and is secretly about something. And it turns out the show knows this about itself and made a joke about it, a joke so pointed that it's really a confession. Because inside South Park there is another show, a show within the show that the boys love, and it is even cruder and even dumber than South Park pretends to be. And the way the show treats that inner show tells you exactly what South Park thinks it's doing. Let me tell you about Terrence and Phillip. The boys of South Park have a favorite television show, and it's important because of what it is and what the show does with it. It's called Terrence and Phillip, and it's a Canadian cartoon consisting of two men who stand around and pass wind at each other. That's it. That's the entire show. Two crudely drawn Canadians. With those flapping heads, the show gives all its Canadian characters farting and laughing at each other's farts, and occasionally saying something before farting again. It is, by design, the stupidest, lowest, most content-free thing imaginable. And the boys adore it. They quote it, they idolize its stars, they think it's the height of comedy, and they're completely, blissfully devoted to it. Now, on the first level, this is a simple joke. Kids love toilet humor. The boys are kids. Of course, their favorite show is just two guys farting. Ha. And it's also South Park gently mocking its own audience and its own reputation by showing you an even dumber version of itself and having its characters love it uncritically. Look how stupid this thing is, the show says, and look how much these idiots love it. And well, here you are watching us. So, the show does something else with Terrence and Phillip, though. Something bigger than the joke it starts as, and it did it in the big feature film it made early in its life. Because in that film, the plot hinges entirely on Terrence and Phillip. Their crude, filthy, fart-filled movie comes out. The children all watch it and start swearing constantly. The parents panic and form a moral crusade, and the whole thing escalates absurdly, catastrophically into a full-blown war. The parents' outrage over a vulgar cartoon spirals until nations are literally fighting, until Terrence and Phillip themselves are sentenced to be executed, until the fate of the entire world hangs on whether two farting Canadians live or die. The dumbest possible thing becomes the axis on which everything turns. And what the film is actually about, underneath the songs and the swearing and the spectacle, is censorship and moral panic, and the way societies would rather go to war than examine themselves. It's about parents blaming a cartoon for their children's behavior instead of looking at their own parenting, which is a theme we've already met tonight, the grown-ups as the real problem. It's about how the impulse to censor and to blame and to crusade against vulgar art is far more dangerous than the vulgar art could ever be. The film takes the position, forcefully, that two men farting at each other is harmless, and that the real harm, the genuine world-ending harm, comes from the people so offended by it that they'd tear the world apart rather than let their kids hear a rude word. And here's the confession buried in all of that. The thing that makes Terrence and Philip the show's sharpest piece of self-commentary. Because Terrence and Philip is South Park. Obviously, it's South Park looking in a mirror and drawing what it sees, or rather drawing the crudest possible version of what it sees, and then building an entire film around defending that crude thing's right to exist. When the film argues that Terrence and Philip are harmless and that the crusade against them is the real danger, it's arguing for itself. It's South Park making the case for South Park, using a cartoon within the cartoon as the stand-in so it can do it without seeming to plead its own case. The show that everyone said was corrupting the youth, that parents groups campaigned against, that got banned and censored and hand-wrung over, put a version of itself inside itself and then wrote a whole movie about how the people trying to censor it were the actual menace. But it goes deeper than just self-defense, and this is the part I find genuinely clever and a bit sad, because the show is also, at the same time, admitting something about itself, admitting it honestly. It's admitting that on the surface, it really is just Terrence and Philip. It really is just fart jokes and crude drawings and vulgarity for its own sake. It's not pretending to be highbrow, it's owning the lowbrow completely. And then, in the very act of owning it, it demonstrates that the lowbrow thing can carry a serious argument, can be about censorship and panic and war and parenting and the whole machinery of moral outrage, without ever stopping being lowbrow. Terrence and Philip is proof inside the show of the thing the show is always trying to prove about itself. That two men farting at each other can be the vehicle for something that matters. That the dumb surface and the serious center are not in conflict. That you can be exactly as stupid as Terrence and Philip and still be about everything, which is, when you line it up, the same thing we found in Towley and in Satan and in Mr. Hanky and in the paper cutout animation itself and in every single thing we've turned over tonight. The show keeps telling you, in form after form, character after character, that you should not trust the surface, that the disposable-looking thing is where the real weight hides, that dismissing something as lowbrow is exactly how you miss what it's actually doing. And in Terrence and Philip, it says this about itself directly by building a whole film around a cartoon even dumber than it is, and revealing that dumb cartoon to be the most important thing in the world. I love that the show is that self-aware, and that it wrapped its self-awareness in fart jokes so thoroughly that you could watch the whole thing and take it for pure vulgarity and miss the confession entirely. That's so completely in character. The show hides its thesis about hiding things inside the crudest possible package, which is itself the thesis enacted. It's turtles all the way down, except the turtles are farting. And the boys, through all of it, just love the show. They don't see any of the meaning. They don't need to. They love Terrence and Philip the way you love something in childhood, completely and uncritically, for the pure joy of it, before you're old enough to see what else is in it, which is of course exactly how most people first loved South Park, before the revisits, before the noticing. When it was just the funny farting show, and that was enough, and it was good, right? We've wandered through a fair few of the town's stranger corners now, and I want to bring us back toward the single purest example of the show's whole method before we start heading, properly this time, towards sleep. The clearest case of the silliest possible surface hiding the saddest possible center. So let's finally talk about the talking towel and the broken thing living inside the dumbest gag the show ever made. I need to introduce you to the single most pointless character South Park has ever made. And I mean that as the show meant it, because the show made him pointless on purpose. His name is Towley, and he is a talking towel. That's it. That's the character. A sentient bath towel, pale blue, with little eyes and a mouth, who drifts into scenes and offers unsolicited advice about the importance of keeping a towel handy, and who is, by design, one of the most irritating and unnecessary characters ever put on television. And the show knew this. That was the joke. When Towley was introduced, the show openly mocked its own creation, had characters complain about how terrible and pointless he was, essentially turned to the audience and said, we know, this is the worst character we've ever made, isn't it awful? He was a parody of the cynical, marketing-driven mascot, the character who exists for no reason except to exist. The show built him to be worthless and then dared you to care about him. And for a while, that's all he was, a running gag about a bad character. He'd turn up, everyone would groan, he'd say his catchphrase, he'd leave. Disposable in every sense. If you'd asked me years ago to name the least significant character in South Park, the one with the least going on underneath, I'd have said Towley without hesitating. A talking towel. What could possibly be under that? And then the show did the thing. The thing it does. The thing we've watched it do all night with Kenny and Butters and Randy and all of them. It reached under the silliest possible surface and put something sad there. Because Towley, it turns out, has a drug problem. And not a cute, gag-level drug problem. A real one that the show follows over years, and that gets progressively, unflinchingly worse. He starts out getting high, which is at least on brand for a towel whose whole deal is being useless and spaced out. But it escalates. It goes from weed to harder things to crack to methamphetamine. And the show doesn't play the escalation for easy laughs. It follows the actual arc of an addiction. Towley's habit costs him everything, one thing at a time, in the way addiction takes things, not all at once but steadily, piece by piece. It cost him his relationship. It cost him his girlfriend. And in the detail that genuinely stopped me the first time I properly registered it, it cost him his newborn son. Towley has a baby. A little towel named Washcloth, which is a joke. Obviously, it's a joke. And it's also his son. And Towley's addiction is so bad that he loses him. He's begun victimizing his own friends for drug money. He's begun selling himself for it. A talking bath towel, prostituting himself to feed a meth habit, having lost his child. Now you can laugh at that. The show wants you to, partly. The absurdity of the vehicle is deliberate. A towel with a crack pipe is inherently ridiculous, and the show never lets you forget that it's ridiculous. But here's the thing, and it's the exact same move as everywhere else in the show, just pushed to its most extreme. The ridiculousness of the packaging is what lets the real thing land. Because if you tried to tell a straight, sincere story about a father losing his child to methamphetamine on this show, in this register, it wouldn't work. It'd be mawkish. It'd feel like a lecture. But wrap that same story around a talking towel, make the vehicle so absurd that your defenses are down, and the sad thing slips right past the guard you'd normally have up. You're laughing at the towel, and then somewhere in the laughing, you realize you're actually watching a quite harrowing portrait of addiction, of the way it hollows a person out and takes their family and their dignity and leaves them doing things they'd never have imagined doing. And it got in under your ribs precisely because it looked too silly to be dangerous. That's the whole trick, and Towley might be its purest expression. The show has a consistent, almost mathematical relationship between how silly the surface is and how sad the center is, and Towley sits at an extreme of both axes at once. The silliest possible character carrying one of the saddest possible stories. And I don't think that's a coincidence or an accident. I think the show understood, maybe better than it ever articulated, that comedy and tragedy aren't opposites but neighbors, that the same wall separates them as separated the good and evil imaginary things in imagination land, and that the wall is thin and that a talking towel is a perfectly good way to walk you from one side of it to the other before you've noticed you've crossed. There's something almost tender in how the show treats Towley, actually, underneath the mockery. It never redeems him cleanly, never gives him a triumphant recovery arc, because that would be false, and the show knows it. It just lets him be a mess, a genuine ongoing mess, the way addiction is an ongoing mess and not a tidy narrative with a bow on it. He's still around, still struggling, still occasionally getting it together and then falling apart again, which is grimly the most honest thing you could do with the character. The joke that turned out to have a person inside it, and the person turned out to be sick, and the sickness turned out not to resolve because it usually doesn't. I find Towelie moving, and I'm aware of how absurd that sentence is, and I stand by it. He's the show's thesis in its most concentrated form. Look closely enough at even the most disposable, throwaway, deliberately worthless thing, and you might find something real and hurting inside it. The show built a character specifically to be beneath your notice, and then used that beneath your noticedness to smuggle in something worth noticing, which is, if you think about it, the same thing the whole show does to itself. Fart jokes and celebrity impressions and a talking towel beneath your notice, not worth taking seriously. And underneath, the whole time, something with an ache in it. Don't get high off your own supply, the towel used to say, roughly, as a joke, as a nothing catchphrase. And then the show spent years showing you exactly what happens to someone who can't follow that advice. And it wasn't a joke at all, and it never quite stopped being one either. Both at once. Always both at once in this show. Right, let's move on to something with a bit of festive cheer to it, or at least something that starts with festive cheer before going somewhere strange. Because South Park has a peculiar relationship with Christmas, and with one particular Christmas character who is, I promise you, a piece of talking poo, and whose story is sadder than a talking piece of Christmas poo has any right to be. Let's talk about Mr. Hanky. South Park's most beloved holiday character is a talking piece of excrement in a little Santa hat. And I want you to sit with how strange it is that I can write that sentence and mean it sincerely. His name is Mr. Hanky, the Christmas poo, and against every possible odd, he is dear to a lot of people. He turns up around Christmas, he's cheerful and kind and a bit magical, he leaves a small mess wherever he goes, and he sings a jaunty little song. He was there almost from the very beginning, one of the show's earliest breakout characters, and for a long time he was pure, uncomplicated delight, in the specific way that only a talking Christmas poo can be. The premise, such as it is that Mr. Hanky comes to life and brings gifts to children who eat plenty of fiber, which is a joke, obviously. But the show plays his warmth completely straight. He's a friend. He's a comfort. He's Kyle's secret companion in the early days when nobody else believed he existed, which gives him a slightly melancholy edge even then. The imaginary seeming friend that everyone thinks you've made up. But mostly he's just joy, a bit of festive magic in a cynical town. And here's where the darkness starts to seep in, gently at first, and it's tied to where Mr. Hanky lives, because Mr. Hanky lives in the sewer. That's his home. And the show, being the show, eventually did an episode where the sewer, his home, gets flooded and corrupted by an overload of waste. And Mr. Hanky begins to sicken and nearly dies. His whole ecosystem, the delicate balance of his little world, poisoned by excess, and the beloved Christmas figure wasting away in the filth he lives in. It's played as ever as broad comedy, a dying piece of poo taken to hospital. But underneath it, there's this genuinely melancholy image of a magical, joyful thing that turns out to be terribly fragile, whose home is precarious, who can be poisoned by the very stuff he's made of if there's too much of it. Even the Christmas poo isn't safe. Even the pure joy of the show has a sewer under it, literally. But the truly dark turn in Mr. Hanky's story came much later, and it's one of the more poignant things the show has done with an old character. Precisely because it's about what happens to old, beloved things over a long enough stretch of time. In a much later season, the show revisited Mr. Hanky and found that the world had changed around him. He'd become, in the language of the moment, problematic, a relic, a figure whose style of humor and whose whole existence had aged badly, who kept saying and doing things that no longer landed the way they once had, who had become an embarrassment to a town that had moved on. And the town turned on him. This beloved figure from everyone's childhood became a liability, a source of shame, and eventually he was exiled, cast out, sent away from the town that used to adore him. And that, I think, is one of the most sad things the show ever did, and it's sad in a very particular way that only a very old show could pull off. Because it's really about time. It's about what happens to the things we loved when we were young, when enough years pass. They don't always age well. The stuff that delighted you as a child can become, seen through older eyes, something you'd rather not be associated with. And the show, which is itself an old thing that people loved in their childhoods, turned that exact anxiety onto one of its own oldest characters and let it play out. Mr. Hanky, the pure joy of the early years, cast out for being a relic of a cruder time. There's no way to watch that and not feel the show glancing sideways at itself, wondering whether it, too, is a beloved thing that has aged into something the world would rather exile. It's a show about being canceled, made by a show that has grown old, wondering if it's next. Now, while we're on the subject of Christmas, I have to mention the single most subversive thing South Park has ever done with the holiday, because it belongs in a conversation about how this show hides darkness inside cuteness, and it's the most extreme example of that trick in the entire run. There's a Christmas episode narrated in the gentle, cozy style of a children's storybook about a group of adorable woodland creatures. Little animals, big eyes, the kind of thing you'd find in a saccharine holiday special for very small children. And the whole episode is animated and narrated to feel exactly like that, warm and twinkly and sweet. Except the adorable woodland creatures are Satanists. The whole thing is a plot by these cute little animals to bring about the birth of the Antichrist. Underneath the storybook narration and the big-eyed cuteness is a dark, blasphemous, escalating horror story. And the contrast between the packaging and the content is the entire point. The cuter it looks, the darker it goes, and the show holds that contradiction with total commitment, never breaking the sweet tone even as the events become nightmarish. And then, at the very end, it delivers a final twist, which is that the entire story was being authored by Cartman. This was his story. These were his characters, his imagination, and the casual, gleeful darkness of it, the way a children's Christmas tale kept curdling into horror, was a direct expression of what's inside his head. The cutest possible surface, and Cartman underneath it, which is about the most efficient summary of the show's entire method that you could ask for. Because that's the thread that runs through all of the Christmas material, and through Mr. Hanky, and honestly, through everything we've talked about tonight. South Park loves the sweet surface, genuinely loves it, and it also cannot resist showing you what's underneath, and it has learned that the sweeter the surface, the more powerful the reveal of what's under it. A talking Christmas poo who lives in a sewer and can be poisoned by cleanliness and eventually gets exiled for being a relic. Adorable forest animals who worship Satan. The festive and the horrifying, the cuddly and the bleak occupying the same frame, refusing to resolve into one or the other. That's the show's Christmas, and it's the show's whole personality dressed up in a little Santa hat. There's a warmth to it, even so, and I don't want to lose that. Mr. Hanky, for all that his story turned sad, was for years a source of genuine, uncomplicated joy for people, and the joy was real while it lasted, the same way the warmth of the town is real even though the town is broken. The show gives you the sweet thing, and then it complicates it, but it doesn't take the sweetness back, it just adds the shadow. And you're left holding both, a bit of Christmas magic and a bit of Christmas melancholy, which is, if you've ever felt the specific ache of the holidays exactly right, let's talk about something the show did that was less about hidden darkness and more about the show reaching out and touching the real world, and the real world touching it back. in a way that got frightening because there's a stretch of South Park history where the show's provocations stopped being safely contained on the screen and started producing real threats, real censorship, real fear. Let's talk about the episodes you can't watch anymore. Most of the darkness we've talked about tonight lives inside the show. It's in the characters, the town, the hidden sadness under the gags. But there's a kind of darkness that works the other way around, where the show reached out and provoked the real world, and the real world reached back. And for a while, things got tense and genuinely frightening in a way that had nothing to do with cartoons. It left a permanent mark on the series in the form of a handful of episodes that to this day you essentially cannot watch. They've been pulled, removed from streaming, from syndication, quietly disappeared. And the reasons why are one of the stranger and more sobering chapters in the show's whole history. To understand it, you have to understand that provocation has always been the show's native mode. It mocks everything aggressively on principle. Every religion, every politician, every sacred cow, the more sacred, the better. That's the deal the show made with itself from the start, that nothing would be off limits, that the moment you declared something too serious to be joked about, that was precisely the thing that had to be joked about. And for a long time, that worked more or less. The show offended people constantly, and people complained, and lawyers occasionally got involved, and that was the cost of doing business, and everyone survived. But there was one subject where the offense stopped being abstract, where the response wasn't complaints and outrage, but credible threats of violence, and the show ran directly at it anyway more than once, and the consequences were serious. The subject was the depiction of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, whom certain interpretations of Islam hold must never be visually depicted at all. And the show, which existed specifically to violate exactly this kind of prohibition, kept trying to depict him and kept running into a wall that the rest of its provocations never hit, which was the genuine real-world possibility that someone would try to kill the people involved. There's an episode fairly early on that features Muhammad, among other religious figures, without much fuss at the time. But the climate changed sharply after some real-world violence connected to depictions of the prophet elsewhere in the world, and the show found itself in the middle of something much larger than a cartoon. When it tried in later episodes to depict Muhammad again, the network started stepping in. Black bars appeared over the character. Then, in a two-part episode built specifically around the whole controversy, around the absurdity and the fear and the question of whether you're still allowed to make fun of anything, the situation escalated into something properly alarming. Credible threats were made against the creators, real ones, the kind that get taken seriously by people whose job it is to take such things seriously. And the network, faced with those threats, heavily censored the episode, bleeping audio, obscuring images, in some cases covering the thing being discussed so thoroughly that the episode became partly incomprehensible. And then it pulled the episodes entirely. They came off the air, they came off streaming. To this day, that two-parter and a couple of related episodes are simply not available through the normal channels. Gone. And I find that sobering, more sobering than any of the fictional darkness, because it's the point where the show's central principle, that nothing is off limits, collided with a reality that begged to differ, and reality won. The show that mocked everything found the one thing it couldn't mock without people credibly threatening to kill them. And the mockery got censored and buried, and it stayed buried. The permanent absence of those episodes is a kind of monument to the limit. A gap on the shelf that says, this far and no further, and the show didn't get to decide where the line was. Someone else decided with threats, and the line held. There's a real-world casualty in there too, in a sense. A minor character was killed off in that censored two-parter, a gentle, sweet, harmless little character who'd been around since the beginning, and because the episode is buried, his death is buried with it, which gives the whole thing an odd, ghostly quality. A character died, and you can't easily watch it happen, because the episode it happened in is one you're not allowed to see. He's just gone, often an episode that's been sealed away. There's something fitting and sad about that, a character disappearing into the same void that swallowed the episodes. And then years later, the show did the same thing in a different direction and produced a different kind of ban. And this one might be the most audacious thing it ever did, because it made an episode taking direct aim at the way major companies, film studios especially, were quietly censoring their own content to keep access to the enormous Chinese market. The episode's whole argument was about creative cowardice in the face of Chinese censorship, about artists and companies neutering themselves for money. And to make the point as sharply as possible, it included a depiction that it absolutely knew, would provoke the Chinese government directly. And the Chinese government responded by banning the entire show, not the episode, the whole franchise. Every episode wiped from Chinese streaming platforms, scrubbed from search engines and social media. The show's very name essentially erased from the Chinese internet overnight. The show's entire run gone in a country of well over 1 billion people because of one episode that dared them to do exactly that. And the show's response to being banned by an entire nation was to issue a mock apology so sarcastic and so pointed that it functioned as a second insult, essentially thanking the Chinese government for proving its point and inviting them to do their worst, which is honestly the most South Park response imaginable. Banned by a superpower, and the reaction is to laugh at it and double down. There's a genuine bravery in that, whatever you think of the show, a willingness to accept the loss of an entire market rather than blink, at a moment when almost every other major entertainment company was doing the opposite. But here's what makes the whole chapter darker and more complicated than a simple story of brave comedians standing up to censorship. Because the two cases sit strangely next to each other. In one, the show ran at its target and got censored and buried by the threat of violence, and the episode stayed buried. In the other, the show ran at its target and got banned by a government and laughed. Same show, same principle, two very different outcomes. And the difference between them says something uncomfortable about the world, about which threats get taken seriously and which don't, about where the real power to silence actually lies, and about the fact that even a show built entirely on the promise that nothing is off limits ran into things that were, in practice, off limits and had to live with the gap it left behind. The show would probably tell you it regrets nothing, that it do all of it again, and it's probably telling the truth. But the buried episodes are still buried. You still can't stream them. And whatever the show says about limits, the empty space where those episodes should be is the show's own quiet admission that some walls don't come down, no matter how hard you run at them. That's a real darkness out in the actual world, and it's the one piece of South Park's story that the reset button can't fix because it happened to the real people and is still true. Let's come back inside the show now and back to something gentler, or at least something that starts gentle. Because in all this talk of darkness and death and censorship, I've barely mentioned love. And the show did try once or twice to do love. It didn't go well, but it tried. And the way it didn't go well is its own quiet little tragedy. Let's talk about Stan and Wendy. For a show this cynical, South Park has a surprisingly persistent little love story tucked into it. And the way it handles that love story is its own quiet comment on the whole nature of the place. It's Stan and Wendy. Wendy Testaberger, the smart, principled girl in the class, and Stan, the closest thing the boys have to an everyman, the one whose reactions to the town's madness are usually the most human. They like each other. They've liked each other on and off for the entire run of the show. And the on and off is the whole point. In the early days, the show gave Stan a lovely, specific, mortifying detail to express how he felt about Wendy, which is that whenever she got too close, whenever the feeling got too big, he'd throw up, just vomit, on the spot, uncontrollably out of sheer overwhelming nervousness. And it's a great gag, obviously, the boy's so smitten he's physically ill, but it's also a tender bit of characterization. Because that's what a first crush feels like when you're that age. It's not sweet and gentle, it's overwhelming and slightly nauseating and completely outside your control. Stan throwing up is the most honest depiction of childhood love the show ever managed, and it managed it by making it disgusting, which is very much the house style. And the two of them circle each other for years. They get together, they break up, they get back together. Wendy, at various points, is a major character, one of the most prominent kids in the town, with her own storylines and her own strong moral center, often functioning as the female counterpart to Kyle, the one who cares about things and tries to do right and gets frustrated when nobody listens. And at other points, she more or less vanishes, sidelined for whole seasons, reduced to a background presence before drifting back to prominence again. Her relationship with Stan follows the same rhythm. It matters enormously, and then it doesn't, and then it does again, and it never really resolves, and it never really ends. And here's where it connects to everything we said about the frozen town, and why I wanted to save it for now rather than mention it earlier. Because Stan and Wendy can't actually go anywhere. That's the tragedy of them, if you want to see it as one, and I think you can. They're 9. They will always be 9. Their love can never mature, never deepen into anything, never become the thing that a childhood sweetheart ship sometimes becomes, because the show won't let time move, so instead it just cycles. Together, apart, forever. The same feelings on an endless loop, never building toward anything because there's no future for it to build toward. The reset button, which we've talked about as a horror and as a comfort, does a very particular thing to romance. It traps it in the moment of not quite. Stan and Wendy are permanently on the edge of something that can never arrive. There's an episode where they break up that's played almost entirely straight with real melancholy, where the end of a 4th grade relationship is treated with the same weight the show would give to a divorce. And it works, because the show commits to the feeling rather than mocking it. And there's something quietly devastating in watching 2 kids take their own small heartbreak completely seriously in a world that will, by next week, have reset it into non-existence. They feel it fully, the way children feel things fully, and it's real to them, and it's real to you watching, and it doesn't matter, because nothing accumulates here. The heartbreak happens, and then it's gone, and then they're circling each other again as if it never did. I think Stan and Wendy are the show's one sustained attempt to put something genuinely warm and hopeful into the middle of all the coldness. And the fact that it can never come to anything is not a failure of the writing, but a feature of the world. In a town where nothing lasts, love can't last either. It can only recur. And recurrence isn't nothing, actually. There's a version of this that's sweet rather than sad, where the point is that they keep coming back to each other. That whatever pulls them apart, something keeps drawing them back, season after season, decade after decade. They always find their way back to liking each other. That's not a small thing to say about 2 people, even 2 cartoon 9-year-olds. Whatever happens, they return. But it never gets to be more than a return, and that's the ache underneath it. They don't get to grow up together. They don't get to find out what they'd have been. They're held permanently at the beginning of something in the sick with nerves, can't quite say it, keep breaking up and making up stage that for real people is supposed to be a phase you pass through on the way to somewhere. Stan and Wendy never get to pass through it. They live in it forever. And I don't know whether that's the loneliest thing in the show or the sweetest, and I've decided, the way I've decided about a lot of things tonight, that it's both at once, and that the show wanted it to be both, and left it there for you to feel whichever way you're facing. And I don't want to leave Wendy defined only by the boy she keeps circling, because she's more than that, and the show knew it even when it kept forgetting it. Wendy is, in her own right, one of the smartest and most principled kids in the town. She runs for student office and takes it seriously. She picks fights with the powerful when she thinks they're wrong, including Cartman, whom she once simply beat up in front of everyone after he crossed a line in one of the more satisfying moments the show ever gave anyone. She cares about issues, about fairness, about substance, in a town that mostly cares about spectacle. In other words, she's a lot like Kyle. She's another of the town's consciences, another kid who sees clearly and tries to do right and is, more often than not, sidelined for it, dropped out of storylines for whole stretches, reduced to a background face before being remembered again. And there's a quiet double sadness in that, because it happens to her both inside the story and outside it. Inside the story, the town doesn't listen to her. Outside it, the show itself kept losing interest in her, kept letting one of its most capable characters fade to the margins. Wendy is, in a way, twice overlooked, by the town that won't heed her, and by the series that couldn't quite figure out how much it had in her. And she keeps showing up anyway, keeps caring anyway, which is its own small act of stubbornness against being forgotten. It's a good thing to be reminded of, actually, that being overlooked is not the same as being small, and that the people the story keeps pushing to the edges are sometimes the ones who are most worth the center. There's one more of the children I want to spend a moment with before we start winding down properly, and it's the one who tries the hardest to be good and gets the least for it. Because if Cartman is the show's monster and Butters is its lamb, Kyle is its conscience. And being the conscience of South Park is, it turns out, one of the loneliest and most futile jobs in the whole town. Let's talk about Kyle. Kyle Broflovsky is the one who cares. That's the simplest way to put him, and it's the thing that makes him quietly one of the saddest characters in the show. Though he'd be the last to see himself that way. In a town of people who don't care, who panic and posture and forget and reset, Kyle is the one who keeps trying to work out what the right thing is and then keeps trying to do it and keeps expecting against all available evidence that it might matter. He's the show's conscience. And the show has spent nearly 30 years demonstrating gently and relentlessly exactly how little a conscience is worth in a place like South Park. He's smart, he's principled, he's got a short temper that flares up precisely because he cares so much, and he's usually the one who ends up giving the moral at the end, or trying to. In the early days, those speeches meant something, the "you know I learned something today" speeches, and more often than not, it was Kyle giving them. Kyle who'd figured out what the episode was actually about. Kyle standing up to explain the lesson to a town that hadn't grasped it. We've already talked about how those speeches faded and curdled over the years, so I won't go over that ground again, but I want you to notice who was usually delivering them, because it matters for understanding Kyle. He was the town's designated meaning maker, the one who insisted week after week that events should add up to something, that there should be a lesson, that it should stick. And the town, week after week, proved him wrong by forgetting everything and starting fresh, because that's Kyle's real tragedy. And it's a specific and recognizable one. It's the tragedy of being right and being ignored, of seeing clearly in a room full of people who don't want to see, and saying so and watching it change nothing. Kyle is almost always right. That's the thing. When the town goes mad, he's the one pointing out that it's mad. When Cartman is scheming, he's the one who sees it coming. When there's a moral question buried under the chaos, he's the one who engages with it. And it almost never helps. The town does the insane thing anyway. Cartman gets away with it anyway. The lesson doesn't stick anyway. Kyle pours his whole earnest, furious, caring heart into being the one person in South Park who's paying attention, and the reward for it is to watch over and over as it makes no difference at all. And then there's Cartman, who is Kyle's specific cross to bear, and the relationship between them is one of the most complicated things in the show. Cartman targets Kyle. Relentlessly, a great deal of Cartman's bigotry is aimed specifically at Kyle, at his Jewishness, at everything he is, and it's constant, and it's vicious, and it's personal in a way Cartman's cruelty to others often isn't. Cartman seems to hate Kyle, to organize significant portions of his life around tormenting Kyle, and the darkness of that is that Kyle can't get away from it, because they're bound together. They're in the same friend group, the same class, the same town forever. Kyle, the boy who cares about doing right, is permanently shackled to the boy who represents the total absence of any such concern, and he can never escape him, and he can never defeat him, and he can never reform him because Cartman is unreformable and the town has no mechanism to remove him. Kyle just has to live next to the monster forever, being right and being hated for it. What I find moving about Kyle, though, and the reason he's not simply a sad figure, is that he never stops. That's the thing. Given everything I've just said, given that caring is futile in this town, that being right changes nothing, that the lessons don't stick and the monster never loses, the rational response would be to give up. To become Stan in the depression episode. To decide it's all excrement and stop trying. And some of the other characters do drift toward that. But Kyle mostly doesn't. He keeps caring, he keeps arguing, he keeps expecting better, keeps getting angry when the town falls short, keeps insisting that things should be different even though they never are. And there's something almost heroic in that stubbornness, in the refusal to let the town's cynicism win, in continuing to hold a conscience up in a place that has no use for one. Because that's actually a choice when you look at it. In a world that gives you every reason to stop caring, continuing to care is not naivety. It's an act of will. Kyle isn't the conscience of South Park because he's too simple to know it's pointless. He knows it's pointless. He's watched it be pointless 1,000 times. He does it anyway because the alternative, the Cartman way, the Stan in the Depression episode way, is a kind of death. And Kyle refuses it. He'd rather be the guy who's always right and always ignored than the guy who's given up. And that's a genuinely admirable thing to build a character around, and the show, for all its cynicism, clearly admires it, even as it never once lets Kyle win. There's a loneliness in it, though, that I keep coming back to because it rhymes with everything else we've talked about tonight. Kenny is lonely because he's the only one who remembers his deaths. Butters is lonely because no one sees his suffering. Kyle is lonely because he's the only one who cares, in a town where caring gets you nowhere. 3 different children, 3 different kinds of isolation, all produced by the same broken place. And the thing that saves all of them, to the small extent that anything does, is the same thing: each other. Kyle isn't completely alone because he has Stan, and Stan cares too in his quieter way, and the two of them being the ones who care together is the thing that keeps either of them from tipping all the way into the despair the town keeps offering. We're getting close to the end now, and I keep gesturing at this friendship, this small, warm thing at the center of the cold. And I promise we'll land on it properly before we say goodnight. But there are a couple more pieces of the show's darkness I want to cover first, and they're both about the show itself, about how it changed over the decades, about how it slowly darkened alongside the world it was watching. And the first one is about a man whose whole job was supposed to be protecting children, and who turned out to be one of the more quietly frightening figures the show ever produced. Let's talk about PC Principal. Around the show's 19th season, a new authority figure arrived at the school, and he became one of the show's defining creations of its later era. And he's worth sitting with because of what he turns out to be really about, which is not at all what he seems to be about at first. His name is PC Principal, and when he shows up, he is, on the surface, a satire of a very specific cultural type that was ascendant at the time. He's an aggressively politically correct enforcer, a muscular frat bro in sunglasses, who has appointed himself the guardian of correct language and correct thought. He storms around the school policing what people say, taking offense on everyone's behalf, and reacting to any perceived insensitivity with an intensity that's completely out of proportion to the offense. And the joke, initially, is the mismatch. This jacked, shouting, hyper-aggressive man wielding the language of sensitivity and inclusion as a weapon, getting in people's faces about their word choices with the energy of someone about to start a bar fight. Now, whatever your own politics, and I'm not going to tell you what to make of the satire itself, the character was clearly the show taking aim at a particular tendency it saw rising, a tendency toward policing speech and enforcing orthodoxy in the name of compassion. And a lot of people read PC Principle purely as that, as the show's stance on one side of a culture war. But I think that reading misses the more interesting and more durable thing about him, and the more interesting thing only becomes fully visible years later, which is exactly the kind of delayed reveal this whole show runs on. Because here's what PC Principle actually is, underneath the specific ideology he's carrying at any given moment. He's an authoritarian. That's the constant. He's a man who loves control, who loves enforcing, who loves having a righteous cause that justifies intimidating and dominating the people around him. The politically correct content of his crusade when he first arrives is almost incidental. What he really is someone who has found a moral framework that lets him bully people and feel good about it. The cause gives him permission. The righteousness is the fuel, but the engine is just the desire to control and to punish, dressed up in whatever justification is currently available. And you know how I know that's the real reading? That the ideology is the costume and the authoritarianism is the man? Because of what the show did with him years later in its most recent stretch. Because in the recent seasons, PC Principle changes ideologies completely. He drops the politically correct crusade and becomes instead a militant religious enforcer, remaking himself as a hardline Christian warrior, declaring the school a religious institution, enforcing strict Christian codes in the hallways, and turning exactly the same aggression and exactly the same appetite for control toward a completely opposite cause. The frameworks are supposed to be opposites. The politically correct enforcer and the militant religious traditionalist are meant to be on opposite ends of everything. And PC Principle moves from one to the other with barely a seam, because for him they were never really opposites at all. They were both just vehicles, both just excuses to dominate, to enforce, to bully in the name of something larger than himself. And that, once you see it, is a dark and astute point, and it's the same point the show made with Mr. Garrison, if you'll remember. The idea that the wound is the constant and the politics are just what the wound happens to be wearing this decade. PC Principle makes it even more explicit. The show is telling you that the authoritarian personality doesn't care about the content of its cause. It'll take whichever cause the moment offers. It'll be progressive when progressivism is the available weapon, and traditionalist when traditionalism is, and it'll bring the exact same clenched fist certainty and the exact same appetite for punishing the impure to either one. The danger was never the specific ideology. The danger was always the man, and the man will simply refit himself to whatever's in fashion. That's a much more unsettling and much more even-handed observation than the show gets credit for, and it only fully lands once you've watched him flip, which took years. There's something chilling about the fact that this man's job is to run a school, to protect and educate children, because it means the show has installed, in a position of authority over kids, a person whose defining trait is that he'll enforce any orthodoxy with equal violence as long as it lets him feel righteous. He's the town's negligent, dangerous adults taken to a new place. Not negligent this time, but the opposite, hyper-engaged, hyper-controlling, which turns out to be its own kind of danger, maybe a worse one. The other adults fail the children through absence. PC Principle fails them through a suffocating, ever-shifting, self-righteous presence, teaching them, whatever the week's ideology, that certainty and force are how you deal with people who disagree with you. And the children, as ever, are the ones who see through it, who watch this adult swap his entire belief system while keeping his cruelty intact and understand, in the way kids do, that the belief was never the point. I find PC Principle one of the show's sharper long-form achievements precisely because he requires the long form to work. You cannot understand him from one season. In one season, he just looks like a jab at one political tendency. and half the audience cheers and half the audience bristles depending on where they stand. It's only across the full arc, only once he's worn two opposite ideologies with the same face, that the actual argument emerges, and the actual argument turns out to be aimed at something underneath both sides, at the human tendency to fall in love with your own righteousness and use it as a license. That's a point that took the show the better part of a decade to fully make, and it made it patiently, one flip at a time, trusting that eventually you'd notice the man was the same even when everything he claimed to believe had reversed. It connects, of course, to the thing we keep finding. The surface, the immediate red, the thing everyone argues about on the day is never the whole of it. Underneath the ideology is a person, and the person is the real subject. And the person is usually sadder or darker or more human than the political costume suggests. Even here, in the show's most overtly political creation, the deepest point isn't political at all. It's about what people do with the need to be right and how little the content of their rightness matters to the harm it lets them cause. Which brings us now to the other piece of the show's evolution I wanted to reach, and it's the one aimed most directly at us, at the people watching, at the warm and dangerous business of longing for the past. Because if PC Principle is about the appetite for righteousness, this next one is about the appetite for nostalgia, and how the two might be closer than they look. It starts, as I said a while ago, with a berry. In its 20th season, South Park introduced one of its strangest and most pointed inventions, and it's a small purple berry that talks. They're called member berries, spelled the way a certain accent would say remember, and what they do is very simple. You eat one and it murmurs to you in a soft, cozy little voice, "Member this, member that, member the films you loved as a kid, member the music, member when things were simpler." And eating them produces a warm, glowing rush of nostalgia, a lovely, soft feeling of the past washing over you. And people become addicted to that feeling almost instantly. The whole town starts eating them. Everyone wants the warm glow of membering. And on the surface, it's a satire of a very specific cultural moment, the one where everything was suddenly a reboot or a sequel or a revival, where the entertainment industry had discovered that the safest possible product was a warmed over version of the thing you already loved, and where audiences were lapping it up. Member berries are that impulse made literal, the pure drug of nostalgia, packaged and sold, and everyone hooked on it, remembering the old things instead of engaging with anything new. But here's the turn, and it's the thing that makes member berries genuinely one of the sharper ideas the show ever had, because it doesn't stop at gentle mockery of reboot culture. Because if you listen carefully to the berries, in among the sweet, harmless membering of old films and old songs, they start slipping in other things. Remember when the country was different? Remember when there weren't so many of certain kinds of people around? Remember when things were the way they used to be before they changed? The berries don't just remember the innocent stuff. Woven right through the cozy nostalgia in the same soft voice is something uglier. A longing not just for old films, but for an old order. A yearning for a past that was, for a lot of people, not actually better, just more comfortable for some at the expense of others. And that's the show making a dark and astute point about nostalgia itself, which is that it's never as innocent as it feels. That the warm glow of remembering the good old days is the exact same feeling, the exact same drug that reactionary politics runs on. That remember when things were simpler and remember when things were better for people like us come from the same berry in the same voice, and that you can't always tell where one stops and the other starts, because they don't stop and start. They're the same craving. The show noticed that the cultural obsession with nostalgia and a rising tide of a certain kind of backward-looking politics were happening at the same moment, and it suggested, not subtly, that they were the same phenomenon. that the sweet longing for the past and the dangerous longing for the past are one longing, and that a whole population getting hooked on membering is a population getting softened up for something worse. I think that's a properly unsettling idea, and it's unsettling in a way that's aimed directly at the audience, which is the move the show loves most. Because who was watching South Park by that point? To a large degree, people who'd grown up with it. People who were themselves nostalgic for the show's own golden years, who kept saying the old seasons were better. Remember when South Park was really good? The show was made for and watched by people in the grip of exactly the nostalgia it was warning about, and it knew it. And the member berries are the show turning to its own aging audience and saying gently, the thing you feel about us, this warm longing for how we used to be, is the same drug we're telling you not to trust. The show implicated its own nostalgia, its own fans' nostalgia, in the very thing it was critiquing. That takes a certain nerve, and it connects to something we touched on with Mr. Hanky, the exiled Christmas poo, this recurring anxiety the show has about being an old thing in a world that's moved on. Member berries are the flip side of that anxiety. Mr. Hanky's story is the fear of being canceled for being a relic. The member berries are the fear of being loved for being a relic, of surviving not because you're still good, but because people are addicted to membering you. And both of those, the fear of being thrown away and the fear of being kept for the wrong reasons, are the fears of a very long-running show looking honestly at its own age and its own audience and not entirely liking what it sees. There's a real vulnerability in that, buried under the jokes, the way there always is. What lingers about member berries for me is how the show refuses to let nostalgia be simply nice. Because it is nice. That's the trap. The warm glow is real. The pleasure of membering is genuine, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. It lets you feel how good the berries feel, and then it shows you what's riding along inside that good feeling, and it leaves you unable to enjoy the warm glow quite so innocently ever again. Which is, now that I say it, more or less what this whole show does, and more or less what this whole night has been about. It takes something warm and lets you feel the warmth, and then shows you the shadow inside it, and you don't get to go back to feeling it the simple way. You've membered too much now. You know what's in the berry. There's a bitter sweetness to that, and it's the bitter sweetness of growing up, which the show keeps circling back to as its deepest subject. The child eats the berry and feels only the warmth. The adult eats the berry and feels the warmth and hears the darker whisper underneath and can't unhear it. That's the whole difference between watching this show at 10 and watching it at 40. The berry tastes the same. You've just learned what else is in it, which brings me finally to the show itself and to how it has changed across all these years, and to the strange fact that a cartoon about paper cutout children has become one of the most reliable barometers we have for how dark the actual world is getting. Because South Park didn't stay the same. It darkened, and it darkened, I think, for a very specific reason. Let's talk about that, and then we'll start saying goodnight. Here's something about how South Park is actually made that changes how you understand everything it does, and it's the kind of production detail that sounds like trivia until you sit with what it means. Most animated television is made incredibly slowly. A standard animated sitcom might take the better part of a year to produce a single episode, sometimes more, because animation is painstaking and there are a lot of hand involved and it simply cannot be rushed. That's the norm. That's how the industry works. South Park doesn't work that way. For most of its life, the show has been made in about 6 days. 6. An episode goes from a blank page on a Thursday to a finished, broadcast-ready cartoon transmitted to the network the following Wednesday, sometimes arriving only hours before it airs. The whole thing written, animated, scored, edited in under a week by a crew working brutal hours to make it happen. There's a documentary about the process, and watching it is genuinely stressful because you see how close to the edge it runs, how routinely it nearly doesn't get done, how the finished episode is often being finished at the very last possible moment before it goes out to the country. And the reason they do it this way, the reason they've chosen to work at this insane pace for decades rather than giving themselves the comfortable timelines everyone else has, is a single word: now. The 6-day cycle exists so the show can be about now, right now, this week, because most animation is planned so far in advance that it can only ever comment on things that were happening months ago. By the time it airs, it's already stale, already about a world that's moved on. South Park, by making itself in 6 days, can turn around and comment on something that happened on Monday and have the episode on air by Wednesday. It can respond to the world in nearly real time. It's less like a cartoon and more like a newspaper column or a stand-up set, something made fresh each week, specifically to be about the moment it airs in. And here's why that matters for a conversation about darkness, because it means the show is and has always been a barometer, a running, weekly, real-time reading of what the culture is feeling. Every week, this small crew sits down and asks essentially, what is the world doing right now and how do we feel about it? And they turn that feeling into a cartoon in 6 days and beam it out. Which means that if you line up the whole run of the show, decade after decade, what you're actually looking at is a continuous, unbroken record of the mood of the times, taken weekly from the same vantage point by the same people. Nobody else has that. There's no other piece of art I can think of that has been taking the temperature of the culture in real time this consistently for this long. And the temperature over the years has gone up or down, depending on how you want to picture it. The show got darker, and I don't think that's because the creators got more cynical or ran out of ideas or lost their nerve. I think it's because the barometer was doing its job. The show is a mirror held up to the moment, and if the show's reflection got bleaker over the years, it's worth considering the possibility that the room it's reflecting got bleaker and the mirror was just being honest. Think about what that means. In the early years, the show's satire was often almost gleeful, a kind of equal opportunity absurdism that poked at everything with roughly the same cheerful malice. The targets were fads and hypocrisies and pop culture nonsense, and the tone underneath the shock was fundamentally playful. The world it was reflecting was, whatever its problems, a world where the biggest weekly outrage might be a boy band or a celebrity feud or a moral panic about a video game. And the show reflected that. It was dark, but it was a light kind of dark. And as the years went on, the things the show reflected got heavier, and the reflection got heavier with them. The targets stopped being fads and started being genuine fractures. Politics that had turned poisonous. Technology that had started doing real damage to how people relate to each other and to reality itself. A sense creeping in that the culture wasn't just silly but coming apart. And the show, faithful to its function, reflected all of it and got darker doing so, because you can't hold up an honest mirror to a darkening world and produce a bright reflection. The show didn't decide to become bleak. The world handed it bleakness weekly, and the show, in 6 days, turned it into cartoons. There's something almost poignant about that crew when you think about it. This small group of people sitting down every single week for the better part of their adult lives, asking themselves what the world is doing and how they feel about it, and having only 6 days to turn the answer into something. They've had to feel the culture's mood in real time, more consistently, and for longer than almost anyone alive. They've had to sit in the current moment, whatever it is, and metabolize it and produce a reading of it, week after week, decade after decade, without the luxury of distance that everyone else gets. And if what they've produced has slowly darkened, that's not a story about a show losing its way. It's a story about a barometer that never got to look away, reporting faithfully and in real time on weather that kept getting worse. I find that moving in a strange way. The idea of a piece of art whose entire method is to stay in the present, to refuse the comfort of hindsight, to take the temperature of the exact moment it exists in and report back immediately, honestly, in 6 days, no matter how grim the reading. That's a kind of commitment most art doesn't make and doesn't have to make. Most art gets to step back, to reflect, to wait until it understands a thing before it speaks about it. South Park never gets to wait. It has to speak now, about now, before it possibly understands it, and live with whatever it said. That's a hard way to make anything, and they've done it for longer than seems humanly reasonable. And what that barometer has been reading, especially lately, especially in its most recent stretch, has been dark enough that it's worth looking at directly, because the show in its latest form has gone to places that even its earlier self might have found startling. So let's look at where the mirror is pointing now and at what it's showing, before we let all of this go and drift off for the night. So let's follow the barometer into its most recent readings, because the last stretch of the show, the seasons that have aired most recently, are where a lot of this comes to a head and where the show's habit of darkening alongside the world becomes hard to ignore. And I'm going to try to talk about this carefully because it's political and it's recent, and I'm not here to tell you what to think about any of it. I'm here to describe what the show did and how it fits the pattern we've been tracing all night. So take what follows as an account of the cartoon, not a sermon. For most of its life, the show made a point of aiming its acid in every direction more or less equally. That was the brand. Everyone gets it, no exceptions, no favorites, and if you thought your side was safe, you weren't paying attention. And it largely held to that. It skewered the left and the right, the pious and the cynical, whoever happened to be loudest that week. The whole ethic was that no one is above being laughed at, and the moment you decide someone is, you've become the thing the show exists to puncture. Around the show's 20th season, it made one of its recurring characters into a stand-in for a particular political figure who was rising at the time, and rode that alongside the member berries we talked about, the nostalgia and the reactionary longing braided together. And it planned, apparently, to do a lot more with it before deciding, in a move that tells you something, that reality had gotten too strange and too fast-moving to satirize on the show's usual terms. The creators actually stepped back for a while from directly parodying that particular figure, on the grounds that the real thing had become so unpredictable that a cartoon couldn't keep up, couldn't exaggerate something that was already past exaggeration. When your job is to make the world absurd for comic effect, and the world starts out absurding you before you finished writing, you've got a problem. And the show admitted it had that problem. That's worth noticing. A show built entirely on exaggeration, briefly conceding that reality had outrun its ability to exaggerate. And then, in its most recent seasons, the ones that aired most recently, the show came back to all of it with both barrels and went somewhere genuinely startling even by its own standards. It built a long, serialized story centered on the sitting administration, and it depicted the most powerful figure in the country in a way that was relentless, absurd, degrading, and deeply strange. I'm not going to describe the cruder specifics, partly because they're crude and this is meant to help you sleep, and partly because it's a real person and I'd rather not narrate a cartoon's most graphic, invented indignities about an actual human being. But the broad shape of it was the show putting the head of state into a surreal, humiliating, intimate storyline, involving, of all figures, the literal devil, and using that relationship as a running frame for the whole season. The president and Satan entangled, and the show mining that for a sustained portrait of power as something petty, insecure, and grotesque. And alongside that, in the same recent run, it took on a whole cluster of the moment's anxieties, surveillance, and the sense of being constantly watched. Religion pushing back into public life, with one of the show's authority figures reinventing himself as a militant Christian and literally inviting Jesus to wander the halls of the school, which the show plays as both comic and quietly ominous. A billionaire tech figure turning up to investigate an internet meme as a possible sign of the Antichrist, which is the kind of sentence that would have been pure nonsense in any earlier decade and now just sounds like a Tuesday. Storylines about the culture wars curdling about which words are allowed and which aren't, about a whole town of people who voted for something and then found they didn't like what they'd bought. It's dense, it's angry, and it's bleak, and it moves fast. There's one thread in there that I think is the most revealing, and it's about Cartman of all people, because in this recent run, the show puts Cartman into a kind of identity crisis, and the nature of the crisis is telling. Cartman, the show's great engine of bigotry and provocation, finds himself unmoored in a changed culture, worried that the transgressions he built his whole identity on have lost their edge, that if everyone's allowed to be awful, then his particular brand of awful doesn't mean anything anymore. It's a strange, sad, sharp little idea that the town's monster could be destabilized not by finally facing consequences, but by a world that has, in its own way, caught up to him and made his cruelty ordinary. And it says something about where the show thinks the culture has gone, that Cartman's crisis isn't about being stopped, it's about being unremarkable. Now, you can read the show's recent turn however your own politics incline you to read it, and people have loudly in every direction. Some see it as the show finally picking a side after decades of both sidesing everything. Others see it as the same equal opportunity provocation it always was, just aimed at whoever happens to hold power now, which has always been part of the deal. Others think it's lost the plot or found it or sold out or grown up, depending entirely on where they're standing. I'm not going to adjudicate that because it's contested and it's not my place to tell you which reading is right. And the honest truth is that a show this large and this long-running contains enough that you can assemble a case for almost any of these views. What I'll say, and I think this is defensible regardless of your politics, is that the recent seasons are darker and angrier than the show used to be, and that this fits the pattern we've watched all night rather than breaking it. Because remember what the show is, it's a barometer. 6 days, real time, a weekly reading of the mood. And if the readings have gotten darker and angrier, the interesting question isn't whether the show changed. The interesting question is what it's reading. The show has spent its whole existence insisting that it's just holding up a mirror, that it doesn't create the ugliness, it reflects it, that if you don't like what you see in it, the problem might not be the mirror. And that claim was always a bit self-serving, a bit of a dodge, a way to say anything about anyone and take no responsibility for it. But it was also, at least partly true. And if you take it seriously, then the darkening of the show over these decades is a claim about the darkening of the world. The mirror got bleaker because in the show's telling, the room did. I find that genuinely unsettling to sit with. And I say that as someone who's watched this show my whole life. Because it means the trajectory we've traced tonight, from cheerful shock in the early years to this dense, furious, despairing recent stuff, isn't really a story about a cartoon at all. It's a story about the span of time the cartoon has been alive for, and about what happened to the culture across that span, as reported weekly by the same small crew from the same fixed vantage point. The show is old enough now that its own history is a kind of time-lapse of the culture's mood, and the time-lapse trends downward. That's the show's implicit thesis anyway. Whether it's true is a question much bigger than a cartoon, and not one I can settle for you at this hour of the night. What I can tell you is that the show is still going, still being made at that impossible pace, still turning up every so often to tell us how it feels about right now, whatever right now happens to be. It has watched an extraordinary amount of history go by, more than almost any piece of ongoing art, and it has kept its little construction paper children exactly the same age through all of it, so that the only thing that ages, the only thing that changes, is the world around them and the weather in the show's own mood. The kids are the fixed point. The darkness is the variable, and the darkness has been rising, which is a heavy note, and I don't want to leave you on it, because it isn't where I think the show leaves you, and it isn't where I want to leave you tonight. Because underneath all of this, Underneath the rising darkness and the barometer readings and the furious recent seasons and every sad thing we've turned over in the last couple of hours, there's one thing in South Park that never darkens, that never resets, that the world can't touch. And I've been saving it for the end. So let's start gently to say goodnight, and let's end where the whole thing actually lives, which is not in any of the darkness at all. Before we land on the warm thing at the center, I want to go all the way back to the beginning because there's something clarifying about origins. And South Park's origin tells you that everything we've talked about tonight was there from the very first frame. None of it was a drift. None of it was the show losing its innocence over time. There was no innocence to lose. It came out of the gate exactly as strange and dark and sweet as it would ever be. Because before it was a series, before it was anything, South Park was a couple of crude little short films made by two young guys with a lot of spare time and not much money. And the thing they chose to animate using paper cutouts, moved around by hand, one frame at a time in the most laborious way imaginable, was a fight. Specifically, a fight between Jesus and Santa Claus. That's the origin. That's the seed the whole enormous thing grew from. Two of the most beloved and comforting figures in the culture, the Son of God and the Spirit of Christmas, the two figures most associated with warmth and childhood and goodness, beating the living daylights out of each other while four foul-mouthed little boys looked on and commented. And I love that as an origin because it contains the entire show in miniature. Look at what it's doing. It takes the warmest, safest, most sacred imagery available, Jesus, Santa, Christmas, and it desecrates it gleefully and puts crude children in the middle of it. That's the move. That's the whole method right there in the first thing they ever made. The warm surface and the transgression underneath, the sacred and the profane in the same frame, the comforting thing and the shocking thing refusing to separate. Everything we've traced tonight, the sadness under the gags, the darkness under the cuteness, the way the show can't leave a warm thing warm, it's all already there in a hand-animated fight between Jesus and Santa before the show even existed. That short got passed around in the way things did back then, copied and shared, and it became a genuine underground sensation. And it led, eventually, to the series. And here's the detail that gets me. When the network came calling and the show became a real thing with real money and real deadlines, the two guys kept animating it the hard way, the paper cutout way, at least in look. They kept the crude, handmade aesthetic even when they could have afforded to make it slick. And I don't think that was an accident or just nostalgia. I think they understood that the crudeness was load-bearing, that the show only works because it looks like it doesn't matter. The construction paper look, the deliberately simple animation, the whole thing that says to you, this is disposable, this is nonsense, don't take this seriously. That look is precisely what lets the show smuggle in everything it smuggles in. If it looked serious, you'd have your guard up. Because it looks like garbage. You let it right past you and then it puts the sad thing in your chest before you noticed it was even trying. So the aesthetic isn't laziness and it isn't just budget, it's camouflage. It's the same trick as Tranquillity, the same trick as Mr. Hanky, the same trick as the whole show, operating at the level of how the thing is drawn. Make it look like it couldn't possibly be about anything and then be about everything. The paper cutouts are the sweet, silly surface, and the show behind them is the dark, sad center. And the gap between the two is where all the power lives. It was true in the first short, and it's been true for nearly the entire run since. There's something else in the origin that matters, though, and it's warmer, and it's the bridge to where I want to end. Because those first shorts, crude and transgressive as they were made by two friends, two guys who'd met and become close and decided to make something together for the sheer joy of making it, with no expectation that it would become anything. the whole vast enterprise, the decades of it, the barometer readings and the buried episodes and the billion-dollar deals, all of it grew out of a friendship. Two people who liked each other and liked making things together and kept doing it year after year after year at an insane pace, without falling out, without stopping, without the collaboration curdling the way most creative partnerships eventually do. And I think that's not incidental to what the show is. I think a show this cynical could only have been made by people who, underneath the cynicism, had something they believed in. And I think the thing they believed in was each other. The friendship that made the show is the same shape as the friendship the show keeps returning to. Four boys who stay together no matter what, because the two people making it were living proof that such a thing was possible. You can be as dark as you like about the world, as bleak about the town and the adults and the reset button and the rising despair, and still have at the center of your life a friendship that holds. The creators had it, and they gave it to the boys. And it's the one thing in the whole show that the darkness never gets to touch, which is at last where I want to end. Not with the darkness, though we've spent the night in it, with the thing the darkness never reaches. But before we get there, one more turn, because I've been promising to point this back at us, at you and me, at why we do this at all, why we sit up half the night, turning a cartoon over looking for the sadness underneath. So let's talk briefly and gently about the rabbit holes and about what we're really doing when we go down them. Here's a question I've been circling all night without quite asking it directly. Why do we do this? Why do people, myself very much included, spend so much time and care digging under a cartoon, tracing its threads, building theories, cataloging every hidden sadness, arguing about the timeline of a show that has no reliable timeline? What are we actually doing when we go down these rabbit holes? Because it is a rabbit hole, and this show is especially good at generating them. We've touched on a few tonight: the confirmed and denied theories, the eye transplant that might let Cartman glimpse what Kenny knows, the puppet that might be sentient, the futures that might be real. The show leaves these doors open on purpose. It sets up a mystery, gives you just enough to start theorizing, and then walks away and never confirms or denies, which is precisely the condition under which a fan base starts building elaborate structures in the dark. If the show answered everything, there'd be nothing to do but watch. Because it answers almost nothing, there's endless work to do, and people do it for decades with real devotion. And I used to think that devotion was just the ordinary machinery of fandom. The thing people do with any show they love, the puzzle-solving instinct, finding a puzzle. And I still think that's part of it. But the longer I've spent with South Park specifically, the more I've come to think there's something more particular going on, something that connects directly to everything we've talked about tonight. And it's this. I think we go looking for the sadness under the jokes because finding it feels like being let in on a secret. And being let in on a secret feels like not being alone. Think about it. The whole architecture of the show, at the deeper level, is about characters who know something no one else knows and can't share it. Kenny, alone with his deaths. Butters, alone with his suffering, covering for the grandmother with the fork. Kyle, alone with his conscience in a town that doesn't want one. The show is full of people carrying knowledge in isolation, unable to make anyone else see. And when you, the viewer, dig under the surface and find the hidden weight, you're doing the thing the characters can't. You're seeing it. You're the one who finally noticed. You're keeping Kenny company in a strange way by being the person who understands what's happening to him. The rabbit hole isn't just a puzzle. It's a way of refusing to let the sad thing go unwitnessed. And I think that's a lovely thing to do, actually, and a genuinely human one. The show builds these lonely little tragedies and hides them where most people won't look. And the people who do look, the people who go down the rabbit holes, are performing a kind of quiet act of care. They're saying, I see it. I see what you buried here. It didn't slip past me. You weren't hiding it from no one. every fan theory, every careful rewatch, every late-night video essay picking apart the hidden darkness of a construction paper cartoon is at some level a person refusing to let a hidden sadness stay hidden, refusing to let it be alone. Which means, and this is the turn I've been building toward, that when you sit up watching something like this, turning the show over, finding the sad things under the jokes, you're not being morbid and you're not wasting your time, whatever anyone might tell you. You're doing something the show quietly wanted someone to do. You're being the witness it built itself to need. The show tucked 1,000 small heartbreaks into the corners of itself and then let them sit for years, for decades, until somebody finally looked closely enough to find them, and you looked. That's not nothing. That might be the whole point. And there's a comfort in it that runs both ways because the show keeps you company too. That's the other half of it, and it's why people put something like this on to fall asleep to in the first place. The show is always there. The boys are always at the bus stop. The rabbit holes never run out because the show never resolves, and so there's always more to find, always another layer, always another quiet act of noticing to perform. It's a companionship that doesn't end, a thing you can always return to, that's always exactly where you left it, holding all its secrets, waiting to be seen again. In a world where so much changes and so much is lost, there's something deeply comforting about a thing that never resolves and never resets and never goes away, a thing you can keep coming back to for the rest of your life and never finish. So that's what we're doing, I think, you and I right now, and all the people who do this. We're keeping each other company, and we're keeping the show company, and we're being the witnesses to all its buried sadnesses, and there's nothing morbid in it at all. It's one of the warmer things a person can do when you look at it right. It's love expressed as attention. It's caring enough to look closely. And that brings us finally all the way down to the bottom of it, to the one thing this whole show is actually about, underneath the deaths and the darkness and the rising despair and the buried episodes and everything else we've turned over tonight. So let me tell you the warm thing at the center, the thing that never resets, and then I'll let you sleep. The warm thing at the center of South Park, the thing that never resets, the thing the darkness never gets to touch is this. The four of them stayed friends. That's it. That's the whole of it. Through everything. Through Kenny's endless deaths and Cartman's monstrousness and Butter's abuse and Kyle's futile conscience and Stan's slow graying out and all of it. The four boys and the wider group around them stayed together for nearly the entire life of the show, standing at the same bus stop in the same snow. They remained, against every reason not to, friends. And when you've spent a whole night in the darkness of this show, the way we have, that simple fact stops being background and starts being the most remarkable thing in it. Everything resets, everything is forgotten, everything darkens, except that. The friendship is the one thing the reset button leaves alone. And I want you to really feel the weight of that, because I don't think it's sentimental. And I've been at pains all night not to be sentimental about a show that would mock me for it. This is not a soft, cozy friendship. These kids are horrible to each other. They insult each other constantly, they betray each other, they get each other killed sometimes. They hold grudges and pull pranks, and in Cartman's case, do things that should end any friendship forever. It is the least idealized depiction of childhood friendship you could imagine, and it holds anyway. That's the point. It's not that they're nice to each other, it's that they stay. Whatever they do, whatever they say, however badly they treat each other, the next morning, they're back at the bus stop together, and none of the damage was enough to break it. The friendship absorbs everything, the way the town absorbs everything, except that when the town absorbs things, it feels like horror. And when the friendship absorbs things, it feels somehow like the opposite, like safety, like the one thing you can count on. Think about who these kids are and what they'd be without each other. Kyle, alone with his conscience in a town that doesn't want one, would be unbearably lonely if he didn't have Stan, who cares too, quietly. Stan, sinking into his 10-year-old's despair, watching the world turn gray, is pulled back from it again and again by the fact that his friends are still there. Butters, from that terrible house with those terrible parents and that grandmother, has in the boys the one place where he's included. Even when they're using him, even when they're cruel, it's still inclusion. It's still somewhere to be. And Kenny, alone with the one true secret in the whole town, unable to make anyone remember his deaths, at least has friends who are horrified anew each time he dies, which is its own strange kind of being loved. They forget, but in the moment, every time, they're devastated to lose him. That devastation, even forgotten, is real while it lasts. Someone always screams when Kenny dies. He's never unmourned, even if he's always unremembered. The friendship is what saves them from the town. That's the structure of it once you see it. The town is broken, the adults are useless, or worse, the rules of the place are cruel and amnesiac and rigged against the innocent. And into that broken place, 4 children found each other and made, out of insults and pranks and terrible behavior, the one functioning human bond in the entire show. It doesn't fix the town, it doesn't stop Cartman or save Butters from his home, or let Kyle's lesson stick, or spare Kenny his deaths. It doesn't fix anything, but it's there. It's the thing they have that the town can't take, that the reset can't erase, that the darkness can't reach. And having that, having even one thing that holds when everything else gives way, turns out to be enough to keep going. Not enough to win, just enough to keep going, which, in a town like South Park, in a world like ours, is most of what anyone gets. And here's the thing about the rewatch, the thing this whole night has been building toward, the thing the title promised you hours ago. When you first watch South Park, you watch it for the jokes, the shock, the swearing, the outrageousness, the sheer funny cruelty of it. That's the first watch, that's the surface, and the surface is real and good and worth enjoying. But when you go back, when you revisit, once you know everything we've talked about tonight, you're not watching for the jokes anymore. You're watching the characters, and you're watching them knowing what they don't. You're watching Kenny at the bus stop knowing what's under his coat. You're watching Butters be cheerful, knowing what's waiting at home. You're watching Randy be silly, knowing where the road ends. You're watching Cartman be funny, knowing exactly what he is. You're watching Stan and Wendy circle each other, knowing they'll never get anywhere. You know all of it now, all the weight none of them can see, and you carry it for them because you're the witness, because someone finally noticed. And that's why it gets darker every time you revisit it. Not because the show changes. The show is constantly changing. It's because you change. You come back carrying more, understanding more, seeing more, and the same frames that made you laugh now make your chest ache, because you know what's in them now. The darkness was always there. You just had to grow up enough and pay enough attention and come back enough times to see it. But, and this is the part I really want you to take to sleep with you, it gets warmer every time you revisit it too. In exactly the same way, for exactly the same reason. Because when you re-watch knowing everything, you don't just see the sadness more clearly, you see the friendship more clearly. You see that these 4 damaged kids in this broken town chose each other and kept choosing each other, and you understand, in a way you couldn't the first time, how much that mattered, how much it saved them, how rare and precious a functioning bond is in a place designed to prevent one. The revisit deepens the darkness, and it deepens the warmth by precisely the same amount, because they were always the same depth, the same thing seen from 2 sides. The show gets sadder and more moving at once, the more you know, and it never asked you to choose between those because it never separated them in the first place. That was always the trick, the joke and the tragedy, the same thing, the darkness and the warmth, the same thing. The horror of the frozen town and the comfort of the frozen town, the same thing. You just needed to come back enough times to feel both at once. So that's the show. That's what's under the fart jokes if you look. A broken town, and 4 kids who saved each other from it, drawn to look like they were cut out of paper, standing in the snow, being horrible to each other, staying friends forever, carrying weights they can't see, waiting for a bus, while someone finally notices. All right, that's really the end of what I wanted to say tonight, so let yourself drift if you haven't already. There's nothing left that you need to keep your eyes open for. Although, actually, before I let you go, there's one small thing I keep thinking about, and it feels right to say it here at the end, quietly, when it's just us. It's about the snow. Have you ever noticed that it's almost always winter in South Park? The town sits high up in the Colorado mountains, and there's snow on the ground in nearly every episode, all year round, in a way that doesn't quite make sense, but that nobody ever questions. The boys stand at the bus stop in their coats and hats in the snow forever. And I've come to think the eternal winter isn't just a setting. I think it's part of the same thing as the reset button, the same frozenness made visible. The town is held in a permanent winter the way it's held in a permanent present, the way the boys are held at 9 years old. Nothing thaws, nothing moves on, the snow just stays the way everything stays. And there's something both bleak and beautiful about that. A whole world held gently in a snow globe, unchanging. The same 4 small figures always at the same corner, the same soft white covering everything forever. I find that image peaceful in the end, whatever darkness we've dug up around it. 4 kids in the snow, waiting for a bus that always comes together. It's cold, but they're not alone in the cold. And being not alone in the cold is, when you get right down to it, most of what any of us are hoping for. Okay, now I'm really going to let you sleep, except one more and then I'll stop, I promise. Because I've been talking all night about how nothing in South Park lasts, how it all resets, how nothing accumulates. And I want to leave you with the one exception, the thing that does last, that has lasted for real, outside the show. Us, the people who watched. Because a whole generation grew up with this show, watched it too young probably, quoted it in schoolyards, carried it into adulthood, and are now, some of them, watching it with their own kids or falling asleep to videos like this one about it decades later. The show resets, but we didn't. We kept everything. We remember the episodes the town forgot. We carry the whole history the characters can't. In a strange way, the audience is the memory the town never had. All those lessons that didn't stick inside South Park, all those deaths nobody in the show remembers, all of it stuck with us, accumulated in us, made us who we are a little bit. The one place where South Park actually adds up, where nothing resets, where it all matters and lasts and means something, is in the people who watched it. Which might be the warmest thought of all, and it's yours now to keep. Right? That's everything, genuinely this time. Let your eyes close if they haven't. Let the blanket be warm. Let the day you'd be finished. It's done now, and it did its best, and so did you. There's nothing else you need to do tonight. The boys are at the bus stop. The snow is coming down, soft and slow, the way it always does. Kyle's saying something no one's listening to. Cartman's scheming something small and awful. Butters is being kind because he chose to be, again. And Kenny's there in his orange coat, alive, right now, in this moment, whole and breathing and standing with his friends in the snow. He's alive right now. That's the thing to hold. Whatever happens later, whatever's coming, right now in this frame, he's alive and he's not alone, and it's snowing and the bus is on its way. Good night, sleep well. I'll be here again whenever you need me. The snow keeps falling, the 4 of them keep waiting, and none of it ever has to end.